Hello and welcome to the first session of the new center seminar, Night Movements of the Dark, the After Dark with Jason Mohaghegh. This seminar explored the fascinating paradoxes of nocturnal experiences, treating night as a domain for the rarest orchestrations of mood, those of fear, pleasure, calm, mystery, vengeance. So, to mm, achieve the end, we will engage night through the tactics of the most dynamic practitioners, those who keep strange hours and navigate the hidden potentialities of the after dark. The thief, the runaway, the beggar, the drunkard, the insomniac, the revolutionary, the prophet, the madwoman, the storyteller, and the sorcerer. We will also seek out its conceptual relations to solitude, forgetting, secrecy, monstrosity, nothingness, violence, adventure, and intoxication. By covering texts and images encompassing ancient mythology, medieval mysticism, modern philosophy, avant-garde literature, and poetry, as well as contemporary visual art, film, and architecture, the seminar will wager itself across the many perceptions of the night that have emerged across different epochs, cultures, and mediums. Moreover, the inquiries will be based on new materials not included in the instructors on recent book titled Night Philosophy of the After Dark, and using alternative collection of sources in order to map further atmospheric and material dimensions of the twilight, evening, midnight, and the pitch black. Also introducing Jason Mohaghegh. Jason Mohaghegh is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at Barbizon College. His scholarly focus is upon tracking currents of experimental thought between the Middle East and the West, with particular attention to exploring the concepts of chaos, violence, illusion, silence, madness, futurism, disappearance, and apocalyptic aesthetics. He has published several books to date, including The Chaotic Imagination, New Literature and Philosophy of the Middle East, The Writing of Violence in the Middle East, The Radical Unspoken, Silence in the Middle Eastern and Western Thought, Insurgent Poet, Mystic, Secretarian, the four marks of the Eastern postmodernism, and many others. He is also co-editor of the Suspensions book series with Bloomsbury Press and the co-editor of the Fifth Disappearance Lab. Yes, may I please ask everyone to turn off their microphones? And yes, Jason, I'm heading over to you.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me all right? Is it clear? Excellent. So, thank you for the kind introduction, Sasha. That was a very fancy, elaborate way of saying that I've spent way too much time over several years being a collector of strange things. And this course is a real luxury for me because I get to share with all of you items and artifacts that I've been collecting, again, as a scavenger of sorts for over decades at this point, in one of my favorite conceptual territories, which is night. So for the past at least 22 years, I say, I've been just hiding things, sort of bearing texts, artifacts, whatever I could find that was related to different perceptions of night, from the ancient world, the medieval, the modern, the futuristic. And so I get to share that with all of you throughout this course experience. I have an old friend, a brilliant thinker, who once said that there are these snakes that exist, a certain species of snake that is able to burrow beneath the earth and find precious gems. It just has a sensitivity to cool temperatures and to the texture and tactility of these fine gemstones. So that's kind of how I feel like what we're doing here, is that I'm going to give you some of my best things that I've come across in the underpasses over the years, and we'll see where it takes us. The great part of this is that last year I did, as Sasha mentioned, I did finish a short book on night, in which I took certain favorite obscure examples of mine that I want to introduce you to tonight, only because everything beyond this point, everything beyond this evening, are going to be materials that I've never taught or shared or discussed anywhere before. So I want to kind of catch you up to the threshold and of what I exhausted, at least in in my book that then sets us up to just go running into completely new and sort of dark alleyways together. So the first thing, if you'll just follow me then, so before we do introductions and we get into certain things, we're going to do some close readings. I've got some amazing works for you tonight. There's a great Iraqi poet, an old man named Mahmoud al-Buraykan, who wrote a beautiful poem called Tale of the Assyrian Idol, which is about one of the ancient idols of night. You know, the Babylonians, Assyrians, Sumerians, Egyptians, they all had gods and goddesses of night, which is something that we're going to discuss sort of at some point. And each of them with their own rituals and cosmologies and really fascinating bodies and attributes. Before we get to the close reading, like I said, I wanted to kind of take you on an overdose a little bit into places that I've traversed in my last work. And then once we cover that, I feel like we can breathe and we can reset to zero and kind of start a new night together. So I'm going to share screen here with all of you. Sasha, you're going to have to enable me to share screen.
Just a second, yes.
Sure. And I can just start going off the cuff with some of the ideas. What I did with my last night book, I started it with 7 very strange paradoxes that I located in ancient and medieval mystical thought about night. And the first paradox was one of universal overthrow, which you would see on the slide as soon as it's ready, and I'm able to do that. So I think here we go. Can everybody see this here? The screen? Excellent.
Yes.
Okay, so the first paradox is that of universal overthrow, which is just a fancy way of saying that there are these ancient cosmologies of the Aztecs and other indigenous civilizations that believed in continual nocturnal apocalypses. So we typically think in the kind of Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, the monotheistic tradition, that apocalypse is a single shot, terminus at the end of time. But they actually had cosmologies where they believed that every night the universal order would shatter into incoherence and fragility. Everything would be up for grabs at that point. So night was always tied to a temporality of exception and catastrophic opening. That's why you see the related concepts there of breakdown, subversion, and the fall, because those were the hours when one could challenge archetypal laws and hierarchies, when structures of power would be most vulnerable. And there are stories where gods could even lose their celestial thrones in these kind of cosmic night coups. You could steal their powers from them. So there is a revolutionary dimension to night, even in the ancient and medieval world, that are tied to themes of conspiracy and reversal. Right? So that's the notion of the universal overthrow. Second paradox was that of the fatal wager, that night was always tied to chance, danger, the dice throw. And night has an intimate relation to luck. If you notice, gambling culture has always been tied to nocturnality. It's not only because it's tied to criminality, which also operates sort of in the theater of night. Casinos are always envisioned as night spaces. And there's a reason for that, and it's that night initiates a kind of state of lottery where fortunes can change, where identities can reset, where there's the erasure of all debts, and where you can make the most high-stake bets, the all-or-nothing ventures, which is why, and we'll get into this later, night always favors the desperate. It favors the one with nothing to lose, right? If we think in that terminology. The third paradox I explored was one of creational error. Thinking of the concepts there of imbalance, extremity, the miscreant. What does that mean? That just suggests that the world is an error, that creation itself is a problem. Maurice Blanchot, who we're going to read a little piece of later in the course together, in a book of his, one of my absolute favorites, this enigmatic work of his called Writing of the Disaster, he suggests that it's only in the depths of a rare type of night that we gain attunement to a certain mood. And he speaks of mood there, which is a really important idea for night. And that the mood tells us one thing, which is that there's something very wrong about this world. We have no evidence. It's not a rational sort of calculation. It's just an impulse or a sensitivity, an attunement to the fact that the world is wrong, that the realization of the origin of existence is a mistake or a flaw, and that being never should have happened, and that it's been going on for too long, and it's gone too far. And this is a slippery slope that's going to lead us to certain dangerous prototypes, dangerous figures, who then think it's their mission to kind of enact the necessity of a mercy killing, which is to say they take the logic of creational error to its extreme limit, to a kind of terminal boundary of its fulfillment. They want to see through the offense and intensify it to the point of the annihilation of the world. And that's the figure we're going to call the miscreant later, meaning the one who sees creation itself as something defeated or guilty. All right, so we'll get into that. Supreme encounter. This is one of my favorites. This is a cool thematic undercurrent you'll find in various world traditions of storytelling, where in the night one encounters a paragon or nemesis version of themselves. So that's the shadow, the double, or the mirror image that is nevertheless slightly quicker, more fascinating, cunning, beautiful, or elegant than you are. Octavio Paz, the great Mexican poet, has a quote where he says, there are these nights when in the alley I meet someone who wears my face as their mask. A really eerie kind of state of encounter, someone who wears your face as their mask. Edmond Jabez, who was a great Egyptian Jewish mystic of the 20th century that not enough people read, Jabez has this story that's seemingly harmless and kind of cute, but it's extremely ominous when you get to the bottom of it, which is that he said that when he was born, his father was too lazy to go and get a birth certificate for him immediately. And so for months and months, his mother kept on yelling at the father, go to the local city hall, get our son a birth certificate. When he finally did, it was like a year later. And he goes there, and when the bureaucrat asks the father what his child's birthday is, he gave the wrong date by mistake. Just in his frustration or his indifference, he said a date that was 3 days before the actual birth date of Edmond Jabez. And he said, this became a running joke in our family that my father had this lapse of thinking and that I always was stained then with this incorrect date on my passport and my birth certificate. And he said, but the reality that I knew was that when my father misspoke, that utterance gave rise to an elder, someone who was identical to me, but just 3 days ahead in the world. And then he contemplates that figure. He says, he walks with me 3 steps ahead of me. He endures all pain three days ahead of me. He will die 3 days ahead of me. And so I've come to realize that he hates me, and he seeks to kill me, to destroy me out of resentment. It's a fascinating notion that Jabez has there. And that's kind of the notion of the supreme encounter. And by the way, the only time that he can encounter that figure, he says, is at night, walking in the alleyways of the Casbahs of Cairo. If you read Nietzsche's The Stillest Hour in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, you see him conversing with himself. And the figure that he converses with is precisely that paragon who's calling him forward into a philosophy of becoming, and he's trembling before it because it's a terrifying encounter with something that is him, but not yet. Which is why if you read Ecce Homo, his last book, Nietzsche's last work, which is a phenomenal, bizarre autobiography, chapter 1, why I am so clever, chapter 2, why I'm so wise, chapter 3, why I write such great books. I mean, it's kind of awesome, his daring in that book. But the subtitle of it is How One Becomes What One Already Is. And that weird time lapse there, that kind of nocturnal temporality is something that we're going to, that split second differential in the states of becoming is something that we'll explore through night. And even if any of you have ever read my work, this is the first time I'm sharing this, but I'll just reveal it. I like to use parentheses a lot, in case anybody's ever read me. And I have parentheticals all over the place. And it's not the same voice. It's the voice precisely of the overseer, who is 3 steps ahead. I split myself into 2 kind of modes of consciousness: the one who's playing the game of thought, and the architect who's sitting above, hovering, and has a more aerial view. And so their interferences in my text, that figure is a bit of a deeper voice, has more gravity, more severity, and slightly more dangerous because they can clarify things from that aerial perception. And so that's the figure of the supreme encounter, basically. And basically, you do this, by the way, anyway. That's what talking to yourself is in moments of doubt. Notice that you just instinctively split yourself into a counselor. You're having a problem. What am I going to do? All right, calm down. Who is that person who's telling you to calm down? right? You've essentially elevated a fractal portion of yourself into something that is superior to yourself, something that is calmer, that is wiser, that is more decisive, that is more ingenious than you are in the moment. So that's a fascinating notion that we'll explore as well. Solipsistic cruelty, that's paradox 5. That's just the notion that the cosmos itself is an inhospitable place for us, that it's a failed host. And having a sensitivity to night is to enter speculation about a neglectful universe. It's indifference, it's estrangement. There's a great Persian poet named Omar Khayyam who said, one night when I was drinking wine, I asked the world, if you had one wish, what would it be? And it said, to just stop turning. Meaning that it itself is exhausted, it doesn't want to continue its own operation, and that it has no interest in the proceedings of our reality. So it's kind of like the God who walked away. Fernando Pessoa, a great Portuguese writer, has a great short poem called The King of Gaps. And the last line is, and all think that he is God except himself. That's something we're going to explore, the secret of what that means exactly too. But that's the notion of solipsistic cruelty, where everyone becomes the stranger. That's why you have that there. Unreal production, that simply means something that we kind of intuitively all understand, that there's something enchanting about night. As convoluted as it is, there's a state of enchantment. And so I'm fascinated by how night's typology of enchantment is tied to reminding us of the fundamental unreality of existence. So all that means is that it very subtly can throw us up and down, and we're going to see this in every work we encounter this term, that it throws us up and down this ladder, the rungs of a ladder of unreal experience, the dream, the nightmare, the fantasy, the mirage, the hallucination, the apparition, the shadow, the simulation, but also entire nocturnal genres of expression. There are types of writing and types of speaking and types of thought that really only have a home in night. And those you see there written under it, which is rumor, the whisper, the riddle, the murmur, the cipher, the secret, the omen, and the lie. And each of these has its own specificity. Each of this has its own expressive particularity, its own narrative potentials, its own atmosphere, and its own types of figures that spread them and that use them. So we'll look into that. The last notion, the last paradox that I wanted to explore was the first return. And this is the notion that in certain instances, we can pursue a connection between night and various interpretations of eternity. That's going to be a really important concept for us to look at in terms of night as a temporal thing, the eternal, because the ancients have a concept of the eternal, the medieval do, the moderns do, and even futuristic filmmaking and all of that has a kind of experiment with eternity going on. Mystics in particular, though, are incredible for thinking about circularity and of night as a temporal quicksand or whirlpool or portal into eternal events. But then it actually, to give credit again, it is Nietzsche who really binds that notion of return, of eternity to the extra component of the phenomenon of return. So notice this, if we start to track things that return, right? Forces, figures, creatures that return and who can have a kind of vicious spiral in the world, we notice that they often are nocturnal creatures. So the first one, if you just look at examples, the return of the full moon, which is always tied to metamorphosis. If we think of the folklore of werewolves and night's relation to lycanthropy, which is just a fancy way of saying a psychotic condition where you believe that you can transform into an animal, you know, and actually Freud dealt with lycanthropic patients, people who thought that you could turn into bats or could turn into wolves. And so this is a kind of a theory of tying night to the idea of spontaneity, evil, accursed transmission, also relationships between the universal and the particular, so the moon and the body, in the case of the werewolf. And also one thing that we often forget, which is one of the defining features of monstrosity, is not power, but vulnerability. Every monster is defined by a slight vulnerability. The vampire can't stand sunlight or garlic. The werewolf can't stand silver. The mummy is vulnerable to water. And notice that they're not otherworldly or transcendent, potions that you have to find. They're deeply elemental and material substances. And so the idea of the extreme vulnerability time. So that's the return of the full moon. If we look at the return of the nightmare, right? So that's the notion of recurring nightmares. Psychoanalysis has a whole host of literature that's about recurring nightmares, but I'd prefer to go elsewhere. Literature has a more active way of understanding it. Psychoanalysis always sees the nightmare as a passive, sublimated phobia, of dream imagery. So it's nothing is what it seems because of repression and all of that, and it's tied to trauma. But listen to this one quote by Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer, who we're going to read for next week. Borges says, quote, "Praise be the nightmare, for it reminds us we have the power to create hell." That's a nice line. That's not a passive psychoanalytic trauma. That's an active production of a theater of cosmic horror. And it's tied to the originary horror of the infinite, which we'll get into. You have the return of the sacred, obviously messianic narratives. You can think of Christ in the desert at night. You can think of Christ in the garden at night. These spaces of doubt, these spaces of questioning, of bargaining with gods. You can go outside the monotheistic tradition to Mongolian shamans of the black, one of my favorite topics. They're Mongolian shamans of the white and shamans of the black. Shamans of the black are those who are able to tap into supposedly accursed forces, accursed energies. They're used in war. They're used in times of famine and plague. They wear nocturnal costumes. They do nocturnal ceremonies. And usually it's a very rare station to be chosen as a shaman of the black in Mongolia. You usually have to be struck by lightning or have a near-death experience as a child with an illness. Then there's also something interesting. When we go back to ancient Egypt, I'm going to mention something next week. There's an ancient Egyptian god, Seth. And Seth is the etymological root of Satan. Later will become Satan. But Seth is originally the god of chaos, foreigners, storms, and the desert, which is an awesome conceptual configuration if you think about it. And what I like about it is that he's an unreliable god. He's a trickster god. He's a cruel god. You can't trust him half the time. But there are certain nights in the Egyptian cosmology when the whole universe is threatened, when the archetypal gods are chained somewhere or have been banished somewhere, and only Seth can rise to save the world. And he does. And that's a fascinating notion for us to kind of look into as well, that kind of return of the sacred. The return of the curse, obviously vengeance, the enemy. We can get into the idea of night raids, which is a particular concept of war throughout history. Think of the Trojan horse. That's a night raid. That's when while everyone is sleeping, you cut their throats. Covert operations often follow this logic. It requires a certain concept of patience, plotting, scheming, and curses usually are performed at night, and talismans throughout most cultures are usually worn at night. So we'll get into that, the return of the curse. Return of the tides, that's one I like a lot. That's tied to migration. Think of the original sailors who had to learn the patterns of waves and read stars. They were actually the first astronomers. And a lot of people don't know this, that the origin of tattoos are in sailor culture as a radar or calling device back to the sea. So you imprint yourself with this thing, this sort of iconic representation that when the sea wants you to return to its waves, it starts to pull you and gnaw at that. That's how it drags you back. It's an interesting ancient concept tied to destiny, voyage, adventure. But this also allows us to think about something really important for our course, which is geospaces at night, different geographies of night. So if you trust me on this, that cultures that are situated geographically near very specific types of topography, the forest, the mountain, the island, the sea, the desert, the jungle, right? If you trust me that those cultures develop highly unique poetic traditions and philosophical traditions just out of atmospheric necessity. If you're surrounded by stone, it matters. If you're surrounded by water, it changes sort of the nature of thought, obviously. And having that environmental context or backdrop. So if you believe me at that, then you can believe that we can complicate it further and ask ourselves, what kind of poetics or philosophy or art emerges in the desert at night, the jungle at night, the forest at night, the mountain at night? You follow? The island at night. Each of these is going to have a particularity, which is going to be really great for us to look into. And we'll start with that actually this evening. Even ice tundras, my God, well, if you look at indigenous like Arctic, writers who write in the ice at night. So you have these sheets of white, ice just flashing in the middle of pitch black darkness in places that are dark all year round or most of the year. It's an amazing juxtaposition, which of course changes their entire mode of existence and worldview, to the extent that that Inuit peoples are among the only ones who have as their main divinity a woman who lives at the bottom of the ocean. So not transcendently vertically high, but in the bowels and depths of the sea. And she collects all of the shipwrecked debris for her home. So she steals from ships, whatever that, and she decorates her underwater palace with that. Fascinating figure. So just we'll get into that. You can get into more Return of the Banished, which is tied to hatred, the exile. What happens when the exile comes back to their city on some night after many, many years? The passing of time, the growing of hostility. How does memory change at night? The grudge, bad blood. If you read one of the great geniuses of literature, if you read Rimbaud and you read Season in Hell, which is a nocturnal journey, by the way. Hell is always related to night as well. If you read Rimbaud closely there, he's got a section called Bad Blood. It's the second section. And he says, I will return. I will be dark when I return. Right? And he says he's going to go into some tropical sort of spaces of darkness, come back with tanned skin that's going to make him darker, and that he is a figure of bad blood. And the last line of that section is even a nocturnal line. He says, but all that is left for me now is a drunken sleep on the beach. So where's Rimbaud going there with the idea of bad blood? And why is that tied to night for him, being damned in that way? The Return of the Ancients, the idea of power, the idea of the idol, we'll get into that. Return of Text, the messenger who arrives at night. A lot of us forget the fact that Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, she's an absolute genius. It's an epistolary novel, meaning that it's written in letters. It's written in letters being sent by an explorer to the Arctic back to his sister. And he's about to die in the frozen world up there. And he's sending this story for her to understand why he went insane to chase this sort of extreme limit of the world. He tells the story of Dr. Frankenstein as an analogy to himself. So the night is often a space of forbidden texts, for any of you, also of you who have grown up in authoritarian societies or lived in them like I have, then you know that forbidden texts circulate at night, and that you have this double consciousness where by day you go about your everyday persona, and then at night you can steal some glimpses of forbidden materials and other possibilities. So that's something for us to look into. Return of the Threat, the extortionist, when you get that phone call in the middle of the night and someone says they know your secret and they blackmail you, that's always tied to nocturnality. Return of the Dead, the ghost, and that's an interesting notion there. A lot of things. Hamlet begins with that, a nocturnal appearance of the ghost. But more importantly, Japanese literatures, which we'll look into a little bit here, tonight even we will. Japanese literature is the only one that I know of that has certain modes of storytelling that are specifically for particular hours of the evening. They must be circumscribed between particular hours of the evening. And there's a type of even conversationalism that they have that's tied to spectrality and tied to from like 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. So we'll get into that. Return of desire, obsession, think of the stalker, voyeurism, desire, transgression, repetition, compulsions. A lot of people don't know that or forget that Freud came across the idea of the uncanny, which is the eerie sense of familiarity and unfamiliarity when something kind of hauntingly returns from the repressed. He got that from by walking from his office one night home and getting lost several times in the streets of Vienna. And that's how he came upon it. So it matters. He wasn't in a vacuum in his office when he had that spontaneous sort of idea. It was being caught in the labyrinthine back alleys and not being able to find his way that he came across that notion. And it happened at night. We can talk about the return of the virus with plague doctors and night visits and certain diseases that only really took place at night. Right now, that's obviously very relevant for us. The return of the discarded waste, that's that strange sensibility when you see the vagrants. And there's, by the way, entire great anthropological works that have been done on homeless communities at night. They run the city in a certain way. From a very marginalized standpoint, but they navigate the city in ways that we don't. And you even see this with films like Taxi Driver by Scorsese. You know, that the reason partially why there's a certain mad difference between the main character that De Niro plays and the rest of us, why he's off a little bit, is because he sees the city at night, you know, in his insomniac circling from street to street in his vehicle, and it changes him to see what the city looks like in the evening when the rest of us sleep. The return of glory, that's the fighter who makes the comeback, the old hero, and there's often a kind of archetypal idea of the night before the great fight and they survey the battlefield. Return to the scene, we think of the criminal who goes back to the scene of the crime. It's tied to diabolical precision. Return to dust, you know that notion, the idea of mortality itself, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. So that's something that we think about because there's the darkness of the grave. And by the way, 4 conceptual figures for us to consider who are tied to the night and to death are the grave digger, the grave robber, the corpse washer, and the necromancer. All 4 of which are figures we're going to meet in the course of our seminar together. Return of instinct, that's the animality. We can think of the creature or the animal at night. We can think of animals and creatures that are blind, like the bats and others that are sort of nocturnal, and how they're linked to ideas of habit, territoriality, and improvised movement. And then finally, we have the point of no return, which is the irreversible figure, the lost cause. And that's a figure of absolute solitude. And we'll get to this. They are the ones who are capable of a very rare experience, which we'll call the night of the last chance. Right? That's a very elegant matrix for us to enter into. So just to give you quick examples of where I was going in the book, I'm not an epistemic thinker, which means I don't actually think that we can reduce the history of ideas to these time periods like ancient, medieval, modern, postmodern, future, you know, and all of that. That's too reductionist. You can find 1,000 different typologies, you know, in the same street. I mean, you read Diogenes and you read Socrates and they want to kill one another, you know, and they inhabit the same exact time period in the same exact street. I can show you Sufi mystics who don't agree on a damn thing. So it's not, you know, one believes in transcendence, one believes in immanence and all that. So we have all of these collisions happening, but just for our sake, for kind of just to have fun with it. In the book that I wrote on night, I did divide it, without calling it that, between examples from futuristic ideas of night. You notice, by the way, that in most futuristic films, things like Blade Runner, The Matrix, we're suspended in a perpetual nightfall. It's always night for the most part. We've either scorched the skies or there's some nuclear reason why this has happened. But it's also to show off all the artificial light and the fluorescent neons and all of that, sort of if we think of cyberpunk kind of aesthetics. But there's something I got into something different with this, which is that I use 2 examples. And the first one is that there's a very talented architect from Lebanon, Bernard Khoury. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. But Bernard Khoury was essentially, he was a graduate student at Harvard University doing his master's degree in architecture while the civil war was going on in Beirut, in Lebanon. And for those of you who don't know, the civil war in Beirut was nasty. Was a ruthless time period. Sectarian violence, snipers on rooftops, shooting at people in the streets. It was a horrific episode. And he had this fancy idea when he was at Harvard that he's a young guy. He was going to come back to Beirut and lead the reconstruction of the capital city with a new avant-garde architecture. And his idea was that he was going to sort of implant the debris and the wreckage of all the bombed out buildings of the city in the facades of the new buildings. So there would be a layer of glass. Any new construction that he would build, there would be a facade of glass, and in it would be all the dust and the debris. Because he didn't want to gloss over this decades worth of violence. He wanted to inscribe the scar into the city's history so that people could confront it continually. Well, there was a problem with that. The problem is that it's a capitalist problem. Who owns the ability to build the new buildings? Precisely people who do not want experimental avant-garde dystopian architecture. They want to build shopping malls. They want to build you know, condo complexes and things of that nature. So for 10 years, he was basically unemployed, Bernard Khoury. And he would work in the back room of the furniture factory of his family in an office that he called the cemetery of unfulfilled projects, because he just had endless designs on the walls of buildings that would never get built. And at night, he would drown himself. He became very depressive, he said. And at night, he would go to the Beirut nightclub scene, which is a famous nightclub scene. Beirut has one of, in the Middle East, has the most vibrant night scene. And very festive and right on the water, on the ocean, and all that. So he went there and he began to know the people who ran those places. After 10 years, he gets a phone call, Bernard Corey. And it's a nightclub owner who he had been acquainted with. And he said, I've got a building for you. You can build something finally. And he said, what? And he said, a nightclub. He said, I didn't come back to Beirut to build nightclubs. I came to build a school or, parks or big statue sort of areas, courts, plazas, things of that nature, museums, libraries. He said, well, take it or leave it. This is your chance to actually build something after 10 years of going nowhere. Bernard Corey said, okay, then I'll do it. And he said, well, there's a catch. He said, okay, what is it? He goes, well, the land is dirt cheap and there's a reason for it. The site that you have to build the nightclub on was a refugee camp, which during the Civil War for Palestinians, Kurds, and Armenians, that during the Civil War, they were all exterminated there. They were shot to death there. He said, you want me to build a nightclub on a burial ground of exterminated refugees? He said, yeah, and it gets even worse. He says, what? And he says, the area it's in is in the Quarantine area, which is the word for quarantine. It's the quarantine sector of the city, where people coming from the ports, foreigners would be housed in quarantine for a month or two. And the problem with the quarantine sector of Beirut is that there are two industries which dominate it. The only thing, nobody lives there except for two industries, trash collecting and slaughterhouses. So the area is filled with the wafting air of animal blood and trash at all times of the day. And Bernard Corey said, you want me to build a nightclub, a space of amusement, luxury, entertainment in the midst of that foulness? He said, yeah, good luck then. And he did. He built BO 18. And he built the nightclub as a bunker. It looks like a bomb shelter, which the Lebanese are very, very used to. And what happens is that every night, I think at 8 o'clock, this huge, massive metal hydraulic roof opens up every hour, once in the hour. And people go in and they're essentially buried alive. And they experience their sort of decadent pleasure principles in this kind of mass grave scenario. Then it closes hydraulically again, and then every hour for 5 or 10 minutes, it opens again, and they're open to the sky, the kind of the brutal sky of the quarantine district. So I looked at this as an example, an interesting example of nocturnal experience. And the second one that I looked at in the book for the futuristic section was a film by a Palestinian filmmaker, a woman Palestinian filmmaker named Larissa. In the future, they ate from the finest porcelain. And basically in it, you have a rebel woman who's been captured, and she's being interrogated by a psychoanalyst in a room. And the rebel's crime is that she's been planting false relics beneath the sand in order to establish a false history for her people in the future. It's a fascinating idea. It's so that she's creating these false artifacts, hiding false artifacts in the dirt in order to construct a fictive lineage. So I use that as an example, and it allowed us to think about, in the book, ideas of time that were linked to, hold on one second, decadent time, impressionistic time, catastrophic time, ghost, the survivor, revolutionary time, paranoiac time, terroristic time, as well as ideas of space that were linked tonight. So the sector, the staircase, the rooftop, the lot, the tomb, the target, because if you look at this, he built the architectonics of the club as a bullseye, which is something that most people miss. You're in the crosshairs of a sniper's rifle, essentially, from an aerial, but God as the sniper, kind of the ultimate omniscient view. So anyway, got into all that, as well as ideas of the desert, the horizon, oasis, the elders, the rains, all of these things. These were this was the conceptual maze that I was able to run there. All of these ideas are ideas that we could ourselves experiment with throughout this semester. How is euphoria tied to night? How is intoxication, dance, writhing, ceremony, spite, fatigue, insularity, slowness, paralysis, subversion? They're all tied to that. Anyway, then I went into modern night. And for this, I had mentioned earlier the idea of Japanese literature having a particular relationality, which is very powerful tonight. And so the example that I extracted here was by a figure named Yasunari Kawabata, who I believe to this day remains the only Japanese writer who won the Nobel Prize in Literature. I believe that's still the case. And I have no clue why, because he's a really disturbing author. And the most disturbing work that he has is one called The House of the Sleeping Beauties. And it's an enigmatic work about a small inn on the outskirts of Tokyo where old men go and pay to spend the night lying down next to young women who have been drugged into deep sleep. This was written, I think, in the 1950s. And each young woman unfolds a distinct experiential realm. Some are related to pleasure or pain, some fear or curiosity, some memory or forgetting. And they do this while absolutely passive. They just emanate these bizarre sort of experiential states. And the entire strange place, this is my favorite part of the story, is run by a mysteriously neutral woman, the madam, who always hovers silently in the background, and she prepares each room and all the accessories therein. And whenever one of the young women dies in bed from an overdose to the medicine, she simply invites the client to enter another room. And she always says this really ominous, disturbing, cold line, please, there is the other girl, or there's the next girl. And so from that, I started to look at how we can understand all of these figures, the sleeping beauties themselves, these 6 women who are in it, the madam and the old man, as prototypes. Now, some of you might have heard Deleuze has Gilles Deleuze, the French philosopher, has a term called the conceptual personage. And that's just, when he says the body without organs or the schizoid or something like that. It's just a way of a non-identitarian way of identifying someone, the becoming animal or something like that. It's usually tied to how they perform in the world, their affects, not any essential traits or attributes or identitarian categories. And what he basically is getting at there is then not having archetypal identities, but prototypical, meaning unique, exceptional figures who arise in a certain sort of moment of time. So if you look at it, we could get into it, but in the story, you start to realize that the Sleeping Beauties are more than just sort of these dolls or these, impassive figures just laying there. One is a guide, one is a witch, one is the innocent, one is the recollector, one is the dreamer, and one is the corpse. Similarly, the madam is at once the protector, the instructor, and the concealer. She hides things when things go wrong. She teaches the rules of the place to the old men, and she protects the place. She holds it in, she defends its secrecy and all that. The old man himself goes through different stages. In the first encounter, he's the watcher. He's tied to distance and fascination in the first night that he goes. The second night he goes, he becomes the deviant, becomes very playful and childlike. The third, he becomes a warlord. It's filled with cruelty and anger. And then the fourth experience is the dying man. And that's also an important concept for us to look at, the dead of night, or those who die at night. And so that's something for us to consider. The next thing I went into in that book was medieval night. And for this, I chose night journeys and mysticism from Sufi mystical circles. Really cool piece of trivia that most people don't know. In certain kind of apocryphal areas of Islamic thought, the devil is believed to be the only creature in the universe who was created by God out of moonlight. It's a beautiful notion. So while all the angels and prophets are made of sunlight, the devil is made of moonlight. Satan is constructed from moonlight. So, by the way, that photograph is by Shadi Qadirian, a great woman, Iranian photographer who's still alive today and working. So what I looked at was, if you look on the left and the right here, you probably recognize the left. That's Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights. And that's particularly the panel of hell, right? Where you see all these surrealistic images way before its time, 1,000 years, before we could imagine it, but not 1,000, but long time, centuries, way before surrealism invented it. You already see, bizarre hybridity, transformation, all kinds of melting going on, elements of cubism even. It's just amazing how prophetic the work is. And that's supposed to be a depiction of hell. On the depiction on the right side is a Sufi miniature, is a mystical miniature that's tied to a genre in mystical Islamic writing called Mi'raj literature. And Mi'raj is the night journey of the Prophet Muhammad. And it's a really amazing genre. It's an unbelievably surrealistic writing because it's a sky voyage at night filled with supernatural passages about guardian angels. You know, the prophet goes in these gardens of paradise, hellbound valleys, all these meteorological orbits. Most importantly, it's about going to this immense throne of God itself. And by the way, when the prophet arrives at the throne of God, it's always empty and it's spinning frenetically, and these headless angels are always circling it and chanting, "The throne knows not where you are," which is awesome, sort of as a thing. So what you have there, by the way, is on the right is a depiction of the Prophet Muhammad's head bursting into flames against a nocturnal backdrop, against the sort of pitch black of night. And they're just gorgeous, I mean, imagery throughout Mi'raj literature. You get this bizarre hybrid horse creature you notice there in the middle. There's tests of cups, of what cups he has to drink from. He stares into the angel of death's gaping jaw. He meets the archangel Michael, who's tasked with meticulously counting every droplet of rain before it falls on the earth, which is a really intriguing kind of mania of numerology. And he meets Adam, you know, from Adam and Eve, the first human. And it's this amazing schizophrenic episode where Adam, he notices, is every 5 seconds turns to the left and begins to laugh, and then turns to the right and begins to cry. And the reason for this, when he interrogates Adam and he says, "Why are you torn between these two states?" He says, "Because when I turn to the left, I see a doorway to heaven where I see my children, and it makes me laugh, it makes me smile. But then I look to my right and I see a doorway to hell where I see my children, and it makes me cry." So it's a really sort of gorgeous moment of fragmentation there. There's a stone that plummets to the bottom of the earth. And again, all of this happens in the backdrop of the night sky. So, by the way, I did a whole phenomenology on this, and that's something I want us to consider too, the objects of night. Because this book, what I realized, or this Mi'raj literature, which, by the way, Dante completely plagiarized. Dante's Inferno is, I don't want to say plagiarized, he's inventive in his own right, but he was a reader of Mi'raj literature. He was well versed in Sufi Mi'raj literature, the Prophet's night journeys, and his own Inferno and his own trilogy is based on that genre. But what he doesn't do as much, because he's so focused on his kind of human personae there, is that Mi'raj literature is more a phenomenology of things. The rock, silk, the wing, the door, the weapon, the tablet, fruit, even the human form gets broken down into particles: the head, the neck, the mouth, the tongue, the stomach. There are different sectors of the night voyage that are tied to all of these. So anyway, I mean, entire meditations on ink, on crowns, on veils, on thrones. If any of you ever read Michel Serres, great writer who just passed away a couple of years ago, great thinker, he had a book called The Five Senses. And if you look at his table of contents, I think it's something like boxes, tables, veils, and something else. I mean, this is, Sufi mystics were writing tables of contents that were identical to that 1,000 years ago. You know, and it took Western thought a while to get to something as cool as that type of table of contents. But at any rate, then we get to the ancient. Our next session talking about ancient mythologies of gods and goddesses of night. But just to give you a quick example, on the left is Petra, Jordan. Some of you may have seen it in films or may have even been there. And it was originally a place where caravans would gather at night in a kind of illuminated space in order to stop themselves from being robbed or attacked by marauders. And so that was its original function. And it's a gorgeous place too. You can actually go there and stay at night there. On the right is the Egyptian temple of Dendera. And what's fascinating about that is that if you look at the ceiling, etched in the ceiling are inscriptions of 7 gods, I believe, 7 gods and goddesses, each of whom rules over 1 hour of the night, between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., between twilight and dawn. So that's an amazing cosmology that's on the ceilings and the pillars and columns of it. Next time I'll talk to you about this. The Babylonians had prayers of night. They had gods of night and goddesses of night. And we'll look at the prayers of Babylonian night. Egyptians had their own gods of night and their own storytelling of night. If you read the Egyptian Book of the Dead, then you'll see a lot of that, the night of reckoning, the night of shackling, the night of breaking, and just beautiful sort of conceptual elaborations. Persian night, that's a shout out to my heritage. The god Ahriman, who's the god of darkness, it's a cool notion that he's in this eternal struggle or war with the god of light, and the god of light, as in a brilliant maneuver, decides to trap the god of darkness, who's also the god of night, in a false world, and to consume his attention with this diversion, this distraction of a false world. And you know what world that is? Ours. Our world is just a hunter's trap for a god to get lost in, an evil god to get lost in. It's not authentic, it's not legitimate, it's not significant, it's a diversion, it's a tactic. That's a kind of cool existential notion for us to confront. Arabian night, we'll talk about that. That's particularly tribal and linked to warfare, gods of night war. Sumerian night, that's one of my favorites. The Sumerians are a real people that were killed off very quickly in history. But you can read in Homer and Herodotus, they have this terror of a people called the Sumerians who lived on the edges of Siberia. And they were believed to live in a place of perpetual night and at the mouth of the gate of the underworld. And according to Homer, it's a really cool notion, and he says it in the Odyssey, that the Sumerians have learned, because they live in perpetual night, they've learned the hypnotic language of night itself. They can talk to the night. And the night reveals certain secrets and certain advantages to them, which allows them to, for one, scale insanely tall cliffs in pitch black darkness, as well as sword fight in the night, as well as, again, speak the dialect of night. And finally, we have Sabian night, which I'll mention a little bit next time, which is the Queen of Sheba, who's a fascinating figure that even makes an appearance in the Bible. She's a figure who comes from Sabia, which is Yemen, today in Yemen, and they had 7, this is real, they had 7 temples for 7 planets. And all of their rituals, their religious rituals, were at night. She appears at Solomon's temple, Solomon, for King Solomon of the Bible, and according to legend, speaks the entire night to him in private, saying riddles that just blow his mind. So he's, remember, the king of wisdom, and she's the queen of riddles, and she wins. She runs circles around him, it says in the Bible. He's confused and enamored and falls in love with her, and she abandons him, which is awesome. So on the right-hand side, this is your Greek lineage and of night. You have Erebos and Nyx, that's darkness and night, are 2 gods, brother, sister of children of chaos. They give rise to two children, Hypnos and Thanatos. And you can see beautiful paintings of the brothers Hypnos and Thanatos, sleep and death. Right? So we have an ancient Greek connection between sleep and death coming from night and darkness. Hypnos marries Pasithea, who it says there's acquired sight. She's the goddess of hallucination, which is an awesome conceptual connection there between sleep and hallucination. She's also the daughter of Dionysus, who's the god of wine and intoxication. So it makes sense that the god of wine and intoxication gives rise to the daughter of god of hallucination. They live, by the way, in a cave by a river called Leth, as in lethargy, which means forgetfulness. That's kind of cool that they live on the river of forgetting. And they have 3 children who are called the Onoroi. The Onoroi are the gods of the dream. You have Morpheus, Phobator, and Phantasos. Morpheus is shape, Phobator is fear, Phantasos, fantasy. And those are the 3 conceptual structures or scaffoldings of the dream world. So you can see, again, they're doing high-tech philosophy in the ancient world with respect to night already. And we'll see what their instincts were up to, for sure. We'll get into sort of ideas of what's the difference in representations of night that we have in the at different time sequences. Just, I want to start then, we're in good time right now for us to actually begin a close reading, and that's when you guys can now jump in and start to interject. The first thing that I want to read is actually a passage by the Japanese writer Haruki Murakami. And many of you probably know of him or read him before. This is one work where I really like what he does in particular moments. There's a series of interludes in a book of his called After Dark. After Dark is a book that takes place between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. Again, it seems like a completely postmodern, futuristic sort of Tokyo of today type thing, but he's actually harkening back to the Japanese traditional storytelling that was made only for the designated for those hours, and he knows what he's doing there. And a cool kind of side note that a lot of people don't know is I actually, before I wrote about uh, uh, his book After Dark, I actually went to Tokyo and I did the night walks that are identical to the story, just to go step by step, kind of follow it almost detective style to see exactly what, because he did that, and they're all based on places that he lived in and that he was frequenting. I even stayed in the hotel where he stayed, in the lobby where he wrote the book, just to see what he was seeing, because he's onto something in that book. And what he's onto that interests me is actually not the main story. And the reason for that is the main story, it's one of the few books I've ever read where the main character is not a human being. The main character is the city at night, the nocturnal city, Tokyo at night. That's the main thing. It's not a backdrop. It's not just a kind of background. It's what motivates all of the events, all of the plot, all of the experiences. The human characters are in fact just hollow, empty vessels, just there to kind of, substitute in for one another and carry things going. But they're not integral and they're not complex. The night is complex. The city at night is complex, and you follow this sort of these different trajectories therein. But there are these interruptions throughout, about 6 times, and we're going to read these together. Not all of them tonight, just the first one, a little bit of it. There are these interludes where there is a young woman sleeping on a bed in a hotel room of some kind. It's a bare room, and she's been put into sleep by some diabolical unknown force that we don't know. And she's gradually being taken through this flickering television that's in the room and transformed into the virtual. Right? So her soul is being stolen into the virtual world. So we're going to look at a little bit of that just to see why is that always the depiction, this apparitionality, this ghostliness of the virtual. This is, of course, from Blade Runner. These are, and just quickly to give us a little bit of sense, watch out if this might be loud on your computer coming in. It's not on mine, so watch the sound. But this is even just a little bit of the cinematography of a show on Netflix called Altered Carbon, just to get a sense of how futuristic depictions of night almost always look.
Jason, the sound is, it's not, there is no sound.
That's good, that's fine. You can just see the imagery then.
Just in case.
Thank you. And again, so that's a good starting point for us then to get into the actual text that I want us to get into. So let's see if I stop sharing that. Are there any, by the way, just quick questions? We're going to have time for that, but I wanted to get into the close reading because then we'll have some real ammunition. But anything right now at the outset with all that? I know that was a bombardment. On the first time, I just like to again, to overdose everybody with a scattershot methodology, just too much to kind of inhale at once, but that way you're swimming where I'm swimming in deep waters.
I was wondering about the relationship between the objects of the night and the tarot deck of cards. Nice. I don't know if they're, yeah, sure. Because there are like 4 or 5 like elements, right? Objects, like the cup, and this the head, right?
Yeah.
So what's the relation?
Well, okay, so that's an interesting thing because fortune telling, if you go back again to the ancient Babylonians, were always ritualistic procedures that were done at night for the king. So divination, and there, by the way, in one of the books that I wrote, I have a whole list of, this is just how weird I am sometimes, that I had like 74 different practices of divination. You can read knuckle bones, you can read palms, you can read the entrails of animals, spattered against the wall, stars, winds, you know, height of a person, a million different things that you can read fortunes through. But what binds them together is that those practices are almost always done. Sumeria, Akkadia, Scythia, Persia, Egypt, they're almost always the sorcerers who do them at night. And so destiny does have a long sort of intimate relationship, and so do the objects of destiny with night, which is again partially why casino culture and gambling culture is a nocturnal endeavor also, because the dice are chance and luck have it's not the opposite of destiny. They're intimately tied to destiny. And so we can look at why at some point. But definitely, yeah, those objects, the tarot cards. And if you think about it, if you go to here, I can give you a nice empirical example. Go to Atlantic City. Don't actually go, it's a horrible place, but go to Atlantic City at night, walk the boardwalk. When do the fortune tellers, the usually Roma women, come out in their scarves, their silk scarves with their crystal balls? When do they start practicing? Always 8 o'clock. I've been there enough times to know when they start to congregate. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason that has to do with their own folkloric histories, but their own phenomenological associations between destiny and night, fatalism and night, which is, this is one of the paradoxes, is that night is extremely fatalistic, but it's also extremely open-ended and indeterminate. And we're not going to read this piece by Borges, but he's got a great short story called The Lottery in Babylon. And he says in it, and it's totally made up, it's a fictive depiction of ancient Babylon, but he says, the city has a lottery where every night we change our identities completely. And he says, I've been a king in this city. I've been a god and lifted on the hands of the people and worshipped. And he says, but I've also been tortured as a slave, and I've lost my third finger on my left hand in mutilation. So basically, the existential challenge of Borges there is, imagine a city where every night you could, if you just pull the right card or the right straw, you could fulfill your every fantasy or desire in existence. You just pull the queen card or the sorceress card or the god card, right? You could have everything you ever wanted. The only price or penalty is that some nights you will be the plaything of others' desires and fantasies. And you have to be willing to pay the price of extreme pain or isolation or hatred or vengeance. And so Borges is saying, in his modern world, basically, of Buenos Aires of the 20th century, where he sees people in their banal everydayness, he says, modernity, capitalist modernity, seems to be selling all of you a straight 6, a nice suburban life of a 6, right? Where your only greatest hope is to die in your sleep peacefully at age 78, you know? And that's what it's selling. But he's saying, but the Lottery in Babylon allows you to swing the pendulum of experience from 10 to 0. You're usually on one or the other. So you can live on 10, but you have to be willing to also go to the extreme depths of the 0 degree. So that's where you see extreme fatalism and extreme chance, extreme determinism and extreme sort of openness also. It's a great question, though. Thanks. Anybody else before we dive into Murakami's weird hotel room?
I have this quick question. You call them paradoxes, but why are they paradoxes?
Yeah, if I had time and I unraveled the threads long enough, you would see why they were each a paradox.
Sure, yeah. All right.
Time. But, all right, just trust me on it then. Okay, let's see if I can share now. Murakami, you're going to see some cool writing here then. Let's see. It was not here, not here. Where is it? Hold on one second, everybody. There we go. So notes. All right, can everybody see the screen here? All right, so I think we're at 11 p.m. when it starts. And we have, so we'll just start, we'll read together. The room is dark, but our eyes gradually adjust to the darkness. A woman lies in bed asleep. A young, beautiful woman, Mari's sister, Eri Asai. That's one of the last times we actually have names in the text here, which is important. We know this without having been told so by anyone. Her black hair cascades across the pillow like a flood of dark water. We allow ourselves to become a single point of view, and we observe her for a time. Perhaps it should be said that we are peeping in on her. Our viewpoint takes the form of a mid-air camera that can move freely about the room. At the moment, the camera is situated directly above the bed and is focused on her sleeping face. Our angle changes at intervals as regular as the blinking of an eye. Her small, well-shaped lips are tightened into a straight line. At first glance, we can discern no sign of breathing, but staring hard, we can make out a very slight movement at the base of her throat. She is breathing. She lies with her head on the pillow as if looking up at the ceiling. She is not, in fact, looking at anything. Her eyelids are closed like hard winter buds. Her sleep is deep. She's probably not even dreaming. As we observe Area Psi, we gradually come to sense that there is something about her sleep that is not normal. It is too pure, too perfect. Not a muscle in her face, not an eyelash moves. Her slender white neck preserves the dense tranquility of a handcrafted product. Her small chin traces a clean angle like a well-shaped headland. Even in the profoundest somnolescence, people do not tread so deeply into the realm of sleep. They do not attain such a total surrender of consciousness. But consciousness, or its absence, is of no concern as long as the functions for sustaining life are maintained. Aries' pulse and respiration continue at the lowest possible level. Her existence seems to have been placed upon the narrow threshold that separates the organic from the inorganic, secretly and with great care. How or why this condition was brought about, we as yet have no way of knowing. Area Psi is in a deep, deliberate state of sleep, as if her entire body has been enveloped in warm wax. Clearly, something here is incompatible with nature. This is all we can conclude for now. The camera draws back slowly to convey an image of the entire room. Then it begins observing details in search of clues. This is by no means a highly decorated room. Neither is it a room that suggests the taste or individuality of its occupant. Without detailed observation, it would be hard to tell that this was the room of a young girl. There are no dolls, stuffed animals, or other accessories to be seen. No posters or calendars. On the side facing the window, one old wooden desk and a swivel chair. The window itself is covered by a roll-down window blind. On the desk is a simple black lamp and a brand new notebook computer, its top closed. A few ballpoint pens and pencils in a mug. By the wall stands a plain wood-framed single bed, and there sleeps Area Psi. The bedclothes are solid white. On shelves attached to the opposite wall, a compact stereo and a small pile of CDs in their cases. Next to those, a phone, a dresser with mirror attached. The only things placed in front of the mirror are lip balm and a small round hairbrush. On that wall is a walk-in closet. As the room's only decorative touch, 5 photographs in small frames are lined up on a shelf, all of them photos of Area Psi. She is alone in all of them. None shows her with friends or family. They are professional photographs of her posing as a model, photos that might have appeared in magazines. There is a small bookcase, but it contains only a handful of books, mostly college textbooks, and a pile of large-size fashion magazines. It would be hard to conclude that she is a voracious reader. Our point of view as an imaginary camera picks up and lingers over things like this in the room. We are invisible, anonymous intruders. We look, we listen, we note odors, but we are not physically present in the place, and we leave behind no traces. We follow the same rules, so to speak, as orthodox time travelers. We observe, but we do not intervene. Honestly speaking, however, the information regarding Area Psi that we can glean from the appearance of this room is far from abundant. It gives the impression that preparations have been made to hide her personality and cleverly elude observing eyes. Near the head of the bed, a digital clock soundlessly and steadily renews its display of the time. For now, the clock is the only thing in the room evidencing anything like movement, a cautious nocturnal creature that runs on electricity. Each green crystal numeral slips into the place of another, evading human eyes. The current time is 11:59 p.m. Once it has finished examining individual details, our viewpoint camera draws back momentarily and surveys the room once again. Then, as if unable to make up its mind, it maintains its broadened field of vision, its line of sight fixed in place for the time being. A pregnant silence reigns. At length, however, as if struck by a thought, it turns towards and begins to approach a television set in a corner of the room, a perfectly square black Sony. The screen is dark and as dead as the far side of the moon, but the camera seems to have sensed some kind of presence there, or perhaps a kind of foreshadowing. Wordlessly, we share this presence or foreshadowing with the camera as we stare at the screen in close-up. We wait. We hold our breath and listen. The clock displays 0. Okay. What are your first impressions of the narrative? Any clues? Let's sort of hunt down the clues that we're given here. I'll stop share for a moment. Anything that comes to mind?
It appears that she's kind of entering a limit zone or some sort of it.
Excellent.
Or the limits between the organic and the inorganic. It's like a fuzzy area.
Absolutely. Definitely it's a sort of interval space or a transitional space. She's in between the living and the non-living, presence and absence, being and non-being, or even more diabolically, she's both simultaneously, which is the correct definition of ghostliness. The ghost is not neither living nor dead. It's both living and dead, right? In a kind of convoluted blurring of the two. That's what gives it its terror. It's not the absence of categories, it's, which Derrida called the undecidable, it's the fusion of categories in simultaneity. It's the overflow or the excess of possibilities. And so that's why the ghost, by the way, is not only a master of appearance, the apparition, but also of disappearance. Right? So good, very good. So it's definitely that she's in between. And in-betweens, by the way, are always linked to fear and linked to darkness. If we think of one of the reasons why we fear small creatures, like the mouse or the insect that runs through the apartment, there's no logical sort of reason one would think, except there are logical reasons. There are primordial reasons why you fear the spider or the lizard or any of those things that can bite or other things. One of them is that their movement patterns are irregular to us, and so we don't like that they stop and start or that they zigzag. They don't follow our linear choreographies of movement. The other problem we don't like about them is that they disappear into the walls. You know, once you try to go after them, they run underneath things, they find their ways into the in-between worlds, and they remind you that there's an entire universe in the floorboards or in between the walls that's thriving and going on there. And that troubles us. And also because they're always harbingers of multiplicity. If you are in a New York City apartment and you see the cockroach, you know that there's more of them. You know, if it scurries away. If you see the mouse, you know there are more mice. And that's always a problem of the problem of multiplicity. So that's the fear of small things, which is always linked to the night as well. Good, and she's in that. Except that she doesn't have a multiplicity, it appears. She is deeply alone to the point of what Blanchot would call absolute solitude. Absolute solitude, I can tell you this, when I used to write about political prisoners and rebel poets, men and women who had been put in torture chambers and prisons, particularly in the Middle East, the first thing you do when you're put in a dungeon is you talk to yourself, because it anchors you, it grounds you in some semblance of belonging or of calm. You say, all right, it's going to be fine. I just have to figure out what's going on here. You talk to yourself. Well, that's being alone. That's solitude. Absolute solitude is to reach such a state of despair or forgetting that you can't even talk to yourself. You're not even alone with yourself anymore. And that's where she is. Right? There's no recourse to a conversation with herself. So, what else do you notice about? Go ahead, please.
Sorry.
No, Sasha, go ahead.
Yeah, I've noticed about the figure of the narrator, and they also seem like they also have this really ghostly nature, because they don't really really have a body, and the only thing that they have is basically the gaze. Excellent. And yes, and they're like, and the gaze, it kind of also reminds me of the gaze of a drone. But
good.
Yeah,
totally. And
like this kind of weird floating position of drone / ghost.
And also like the gaze of the Egyptian eye, right? Which is the god, like the god in the sky, right?
Exactly. Although, and I like that you guys have connected these, the drone and the Egyptian eye. Except that there's one interesting thing. There's a Palestinian poet who wrote a couple of years ago a collection of poetry called "The Drone Eats with Me," which is a really heavy title. And if you know anything about Palestinian history, you understand what he's talking about. We're not in the ancient modality of warfare where you would plunge a spear into someone's chest, in some bravado way, and you'd actually have to pay the existential price of seeing the last fear of the enemy, the last breath of the enemy. You'd have to get their saliva and their sweat and their blood on you. You'd have to hear the crunching of bones and the final gasps. We're in the mechanical intermediated state of distance warfare, right? And so the drone is a perfect example of that. What Afghani poets have written about, particularly women Afghani poets, there's a great collection of Afghani women's poetry that you can look at where they talk about the terror of the neutral. And that's what the drone represents. And that's exactly what Murakami's narrative voice is here. It is the terror of the neutral. You can't guess for a second where he stands in this. It's this anonymous, impersonal, cold as ice, metallic, neutral, digital voice almost of narration. And that's something that we'll explore as connected tonight as well. Sort of that figure, and it places us in that. So what's our role sort of within this narrative structure as she sleeps there? By the way, later in the class, we're going to read Hélène Cixous, something that she wrote about that she severely dislikes the paradigm of the fairy tales where young women are asleep, unless it's other women who have put them to sleep. So that's like sort of, the snow and all that. But she dislikes the kind of archetypal femininity of the sleeping sort of woman. She doesn't mean Murakami here, and there are reasons why he would escape that critique. But what she's really interested in are the children, the young girls of Grimm's fairy tale, who precisely steal into the forests and the sort of underground tunnels into wells, kind of like Alice does in Wonderland. Find their way into these secret passages at night, precisely. And she counteracts that. But what's intriguing here is what is then our functionality as viewers in this? What are we told? We're given precise kind of rules or guidelines.
That we are here almost like voyeurs.
Exactly.
The way it's focalized is through this, it's through a technology of some sort, and the apparatus is completely disembodied. And that's what has the agency. The girl has no agency, so I would absolutely concur with Cixous. Another thing that I noticed, I didn't really think about nocturnal creatures, but I noticed that the description of the room had presumed that this girl was a child, that there should be stuffed toys and dolls or whatever, not really a young woman. Anyhow, it seemed to me that we were being focalized through a voyeuristic gaze, which should take pleasure in looking at the beautiful hair and the breath and the neck and so forth.
Excellent. Nicole, do you know about the watcher angels of the Bible? It's a fascinating thing. The name Gregory actually comes from the Grigori, who were watcher angels, who were tasked by God. This is, by the way, like one line in Genesis that we can extrapolate all of this from. God appoints watcher angels over the first humans outside the garden to not intervene. They have the very careful instruction to never intervene, but to monitor them on his behalf, right? Which is a weird kind of fractioning of omniscience, because you would think that God can see everything anyway. But the intriguing notion there is that as they're tasked to watch Eve and the children of Adam and Eve sort of in the next generation and all that, they begin to fall in love with them. And the Grigoris start to have illicit affairs at night, sort of in the blind spots of God, and they start to populate the earth with a bastard race between angel and human. And it is suggested in Genesis that this is the cause of the flood, is the birth of a race called the Nephilim. And the Nephilim are giants who are born of the watcher angels and the first human races. And so they are tasked with precisely our sort of function here in Murakami's text. They're supposed to be non-intervening, semi-benevolent kind of sort of watchers, but they become obsessive in their fascination to the point of extreme desire, to the point of creating damned creatures. And so it's an intriguing notion of what we're being set up for then. Are we supposed to be falling in love with this person? Is it a relationship of infatuation, which is troubled by the fact of, like you said, you noted all the kind of the weird references to the absence of innocent artifacts, the absence of infantilizing artifacts that are there. So we don't have the dolls, we don't have the stuffed animal, but we do have the references to them, which is also creepy at some level. The reference of the absence, which tells us something. It basically is suggested on 3 occasions in the half of the narrative that we read together that what has happened to the room. And it's, by the way, identical to Baudrillard, Jean Baudrillard's philosophical elaboration of the perfect crime. If you read his book, The Perfect Crime, at the beginning, he says, I show up on the scene of reality like a detective, and I know that something has died here. Something was killed here. A murder has gone down. Except I've got a problem, Baudrillard says. I don't have any murder weapon. I don't have a corpse. I don't have a killer or a perpetrator. I don't have witnesses. I don't have alibis. I don't have motives. I don't have blood trail. I have zero evidence whatsoever that any crime has occurred. Except I know that a murder has taken place. And that is the murder of reality itself, by the way, the murder of the real. And how does he know it? It's too clean. It's too perfect. There are no traces. That's the same thing we're here with. This room has been whitewashed. All fingerprints have been erased. So our question is, who has done this? Is it the narrator? We later learn that there's this television screen, which is again a portal to another virtual kind of realm where she's being dragged diabolically, a lot like kind of the mirror images in Snow White and stuff like that, but we don't have to get into that. Anything else that you noticed then about this sterile, sanitized room that's obviously been tampered with?
Yeah, I wanted to just say something about the only presence, this kind of moment, this statement of like, the only presence of light being the clock, and it's kind of thinking, and in fact, kind of maybe thinking about what you were saying earlier about the book, in that it, you know, is about kind of, it doesn't really involve the human character as much, and there's sort of like a minimalism of description there, and more of a kind of description of the processes. You know, I was thinking about the kind of the the kind of contrast between this like placid figure sleeping on the bed and then this kind of constant erratic blinking of the clock. And I was kind of also thinking about there's, you know, I was just recently reading some stuff by like Giordano Bruno. He like mentions at one point, it's quite interesting, like, I guess that like darkness can't really penetrate light, but light always penetrates darkness in a sense. And I think just to think about this as like a kind of vital process that's going on.
Excellent. Well, there's an interesting end to that. There's a really interesting commentary that can be developed out of that. There's an idea that's held by a number of theorists. It's not anything particularly exclusive to one. The idea is this, is that for millennia, if you even give Freud just a tiny bit of credit, that there may be this unconscious realm, or there may be this sort of wellspring of bizarre drives and desires beneath the surface of human experience, if you believe that, then it means that for thousands of years, humanity has been the source of just madness, delirium, passion, right? Compulsions, massive drives, sort of, and all that. And where have they gone in our sort of banalized modernity, our mundane modernity, where we become increasingly anesthetized, numbed, narcotized, bored? It can't go nowhere. It's energy. It's an intensity. It has to go somewhere. And the notion that some have, that they speculate, is that all of the delirium, the insanity, the passion, the frenzy, the fever of the human has been poured into its objects. Our devices are freaking crazy. They're insane if you look at them the right way. They're harboring this. And it's a great notion that, I'll just tell you this quickly, the mystical poet Rumi, who some of you may know, Jalaluddin Rumi, he has a great little story where he says that there was this Persian king or sultan who invited a group of Chinese artists and Roman artists. And Roman is a code name for Sufi mystic in Persian. His own name, Rumi, means of Rome. So anyway, they come together, these two contingents of master artists, to prove who has the better tradition of aesthetics, who are the greater artists. And the Sultan gives the Chinese artists one massive parlor room, and then opposite it, they give the Roman artists their own. And the Chinese artists go to work. They ask for hundreds of different colors from the Sultan's treasury. He brings them all these dyes, and they start painting the most elegant, elaborate, sophisticated miniatures and curvatures and imagery and vegetal landscapes and events and epic battles. It's fascinating what they're doing. Meanwhile, the Roman masters tell their assistants, their apprentices, simply to keep polishing the hell out of their wall over and over again. Polish it to the point that it glistens and gleams. And what happens is when the Sultan arrives and says, let's unveil the curtains from both, they unveil the Chinese one, which is exquisite and is a showcase of traditional mastery. And then the Romans unlift their curtain and it's a pure mirror on the other side. And the Sultan agrees that the mirror image is superior aesthetically. It's more beautiful in the mirror. You know, it's more radiant and attractive in its mirror form, which is where Sufi mystics get the idea, by the way, and it's a cool little piece of trivia for you guys to drop at a cocktail party in case you want, that the only place that one can ever glimpse God, catch just a side glance of God, is in a broken mirror. I even like the little complication of not a whole mirror, not a welcome, but a shattered mirror. In the shard of a mirror, you can catch a passing divinity like Alice catches the white rabbit in her peripheral vision. So there's a lot of cool stuff to that. Good. And actually, that's a good segue. Unless we have anything else about this to add, we can segue into the Assyrian idol for a little while and go ancient. Anybody have a point?
Small, short remark, Jason. Unless the narrator and we as the readers are equipped with night vision binoculars, how are we able to see all of this stuff? It is midnight and the area side character is asleep. It should be dark, but nevertheless we see the room.
Excellent. I like this question because it charges us then with assuming that our normal philosophical powers are obsolete here. All of us start out as amateurs or novices in the night. And for anybody who's ever had the experience of going into a foreign city and wandering at night, then you know that. I mean, you know the sort of the unfamiliarity, the disorientation, the vertigo. You know, you're facing one alley or another and you don't know which one. So you try and summon some type of instinctuality, some concept of instinct that tells you this is the better way to go or this one. Or you just chase some type of attractive orbit. You know, you catch a glimpse of something down that path that would be more interesting. But it requires us, you're absolutely right, to adapt and to adjust to a kind of nocturnal consciousness, which is different than our everydayness. It is different than the Enlightenment, modern subjectivity that has been constructed around us. We'll get into then what we have to do. I think actually Borges will be a great point of departure for teaching us when we meet the Minotaur, when we meet his Minotaur of the Labyrinth. He will be our first teacher, the Minotaur, of how to survive the night, how to endure the night, how to master the night. Because all the Minotaur has are long, endless nights by himself, walking the labyrinth. So that'll be a first step. Also, the Library of Babel is the other thing that we're reading by Borges. And these seekers who come to this weird, ominous library, infinite library, and just wander the hallways with a torch or a lantern in their hand, trying to find the one text that will answer all riddles of the universe. That's going to be another thing that teaches us about the night. But definitely, I like that we say it that way because it means that we have to devise manuals, diagrams, codes. That's our thinking. We have to think tactically above all else. Excellent. Cool. So let's see if I can take us to, and actually maybe our first teacher then is not the Minotaur, but rather an ancient idol. So let's go to this and see if I can bring it up. Can everybody see this on the side here? Can you nod for me if you do? Okay, great. This is the Tale of the Assyrian Statue by Mahmud al-Burai Khan. Here's a side secret that I'm going to disclose and divulge to all of you. Many of the writers that I've selected for our purposes, because these are some of my absolute favorite writers of night, have a particularly personal relationship to it. So Borges, for one, went blind gradually. And for those who don't know his biography, and he's deeply aware of the gradual loss of eyesight, the cataract forming sort of to the point of enveloping him in darkness. So his increasing fascination with night is a very concrete material one, because he's plunging into it. When we read Una Kazern, who's an absolutely fascinating, wonderful schizophrenic artist and writer, and we read her text called The Man of Jasmine, where she discusses how when she was 6 years old, she married a shadow in a garden called the Man of Jasmine. And we were going to read her, and she gets infatuated with numerology and all kinds of schizophrenic things. She threw herself from an apartment window at night and committed suicide. So did Alejandra Pizarnik, who we're going to read, who's a great Argentinian poet, fascinated with the night. She also undid herself at night, as well as some of the others who are going to have really interesting takes. So not that they're all tragic casualties of the night, but many of them are, including Mahmoud al-Buraykan. So here's an interesting thing to know about him. He's one of the most talented, I won't qualify by saying Iraqi, he's one of the most talented poets of the 20th century. The problem we have with him is that he never wanted to publish his own work, kind of like Kafka. And so the only pieces that we have of his are stolen from his friends and published against his will. Well, Mahmoud al-Buraykan just about 10 years ago was killed in the middle of the night at age, I believe, 82. He was in his 80s as an old man in his home. Looters and thieves during the occupation of Iraq broke into his home and stabbed him to death. And this is one of his great works that we are holding here, against his will. So let's read it together. And it's set in a museum, and it's about an ancient Assyrian idol. In a glass room in a museum that squats in a lost city that crouches in a deserted land on a vast continent, I live, elevated, confronting the eyes of men and paralyzing them. At silence's end, I shake them off, the events of time and the terror of the 9th century. Idol of Nineveh, its master, in an inscrutable moment, my being emerged to the echo of a chisel in the hands of a sculptor in the hall of stones and clay. In terror, tribes of the dead make me blood offerings. How many voices tremble with the nightmare in the cadence of the chant? I was called many names, scented with perfumes and essences, hung with rings. My eyes, 2 diamonds that pierce the night, come from minds whose secrets no man has discovered. Does time admit to this memory? I have seen the gentle moon at night's beginning, heard the tumult of the earthquake before the hour of 10. I have seen the horses invade women's cloisters. I saw the lances rise high with skulls of men. I saw the swords descend. I saw how the bride dances in the ceremony of death, and how suns extinguish the storms of capitals. Does time admit to this memory? The fall of castles and walls, drought and rains, wheat and iron, and the power of the sword at which men stare with awe as it lies in its leather scabbard. Does time admit to that illusion? The secret date for the death of a legend and the beginning of an impossible undertaking, the plagues of history, cycles of unknown duration, the blaze of fires coloring faces, coloring the gardens and sky, the will to power, the lust to destroy. I have lost my jewels, been stripped of my rings, my locks sheared. I've been rolled off my original base, moved from place to place. The owls and eagles spoke to me. Little boys climbed my ribs. A hammer was once tested on my body. I was tied with ropes, dragged along, stretched out on my face behind a pair of mules. Once I guarded a wall. Another time I stood at the gate of a palace, marched in file in one of the armies, was abandoned in the desert, spread out to be washed by the gales, for the hot sandstorms to dry out, my deepest chambers. Casting an eternal gaze, my white sockets open to the world of stars. The sea recedes, only the shells remain at the bottom of the earth. Wind after wind redistributes the red sands. The ravens have landed here and meshed into the cycle of the horizon. Eagles' wings have fluttered on my neck, then burned on the summits of sand dunes. Old wolves made a pillow of my body as they passed by, fleeing to somewhere. Caravans of thieves took shade at my sides, where precious stones left their mark, where ants built the earthen kingdom of blind balance. In the glass room, I stand erect. Women stare at my uncomplicated body, stare precisely at the center of the crotch. Children take delight because my ear has fallen off and my eyebrow is broken, because in my chest there is a gaping hole, so frightening in the light. In the glass room, sound does not enter. The surface of death is not touched. Some men appear and continue whispering, perhaps about my left nail. In the glass room, the worn out fingers do not fall off. The sun does not penetrate, but the microscope does. In the glass room alone, the solitary corpse stands erect. Okay. So, what do we make of the Assyrian idol? If you had to project a kind of tonality to its narration, what's the tone of the idol? Euphoric, tragic?
It's a kind of lament, isn't it?
Absolutely. It is a lament. It's a lament of an insult, right? That this was once a great being. This was once a great idol worshipped by men and women, and now discarded, placed in the category of obsolescence, of irrelevance, placed in the glass case rather than the pedestal, right? It offends. And so the interesting thing is, what do we do with betrayal? Betrayal leads to what concept usually?
Revenge.
Excellent, thank you guys. Revenge. Revenge is housed in night, if we think about it. When we picture, I mean, even vigilante culture, right? When we picture Batman, the most archetypal kind of vigilante, stupid vigilante you can imagine, sort of mommy-daddy issues, typical psychoanalytic trauma and all of that. It's not a very complicated story, but it's the Dark Knight, sort of takes the mask of a nocturnal creature, right? In order to pursue criminality. But what is the problem of the vigilante? Now, this is an interesting thing. It's always a slippery slope. Why? One wants revenge. First let's answer this question, because vengeance is a wonderful nocturnal thematic. In what way is revenge absolutely flexible and absolutely inflexible? There are certain dimensions of vengeance that cannot, or that are immutable in their focus, and there are some that are very, very fluid. So in the what, where, how, when, why of vengeance, what has to remain absolutely fixed? What never changes?
I suppose the power relations and the force. And
Sure. Of the who, what, when, where, and why, which I'll give you a hint, two of the categories are always fixed. They are almost unwavering.
Stable power relations and
When what?
That's right. So
Sorry.
that's, yeah, the stable power relation, that would be the who. Exactly. Who did it to you? You always remember that with a kind of
What?
compulsive fixation, and the what. What was done to you, right?
And
Notice the inventory, very careful, meticulous cataloging of the crimes. The wolves used me as a pillow. Men put their, hammers against my body. He has a very careful sort of notation or documentation or testimony of those. Go ahead, Sasha.
also, what I noticed about this is his or their impossibility to do anything. So the idol is like they're very angry, but simultaneously they're like really, really frustrated about the fact that they can't really do anything and can't really explode this museum.
For now, that's the interesting thing. For now, there is a threatening aspect to the tonality that says that it's biding its time and waiting for a temporal opportunity to resurrect itself. And this, by the way, goes to a very primordial fear kind of factor, a phobia of humans that towards the automaton, right? So even children have an instinct that the dolls they play with at night, sometimes they cover them in the room at night, and they don't like the scarecrow on the farm at night, and they don't like the clown, statue in their room. They don't like things, or the statue itself, or the mannequin. There's an eerie sensibility that these actually still possess animus, an animistic quality, that they can still move, and that they move precisely when we are unmoving. And the reason we are bothered by that, instead of thinking of it as a banquet or a festive kind of thing, or they have masquerades at night while we sleep, is that we suspect that if they could come back to life, they would want to overthrow us. They would seek our destruction. It would be a death wish that they would have for us. So back to the configuration of vengeance. If the who and what almost always remain the same, what are the other elements that are completely variable for the vengeful one?
Maybe something like temporality. Because
that's right, when they do it.
the statue locates the revenge in the future, which is the scariest part, because if it's controlled in the present, something will definitely change and it can take the revenge.
Explain to me this, Alexei. In what sense, if there's such urgency, revenge has a sense of urgency, it has a speed to it, a velocity to it. Why is it that the vengeful are so patient? It's because the extreme limit of urgency or speed is inevitability. They are absolutely calm in the knowledge that this is a done deal. It's as good as done. It's sealed already. It's just a formality. It's just an academic exercise at this point. You follow? And so they sit in the assurance of, doesn't matter if it's tomorrow or if it's 40 years from now, it will happen. And that's the idol's sort of temporal come. So that's the when of vengeance, good, that is completely open-ended.
The second is the magnitude. Like the magnitude is always like increased, you know, like it's always like to avenge like so like avenge like sevenfold, like the bad.
The overkill. Exactly. So you're exactly right. And actually, Bataille likes to talk about that when he talks about the accursed share, which is the idea that ancient societies knew that you had to pay tribute and pay homage to the gods of radical negativity, gods of war, gods of curse, gods of starvation, gods of catastrophe. You had to give them their pay. Otherwise, they would take 5 times as much. You follow? So it's a smart calculation. It's not it's not that the Aztecs liked cutting off heads because they were sadistic, bloodlusting barbarians. It's that their calculus, their very sort of regimented calculus is, if we don't give 5, the god will take 50 somehow.
And also that it reminds me of like the ethics of monotheistic religions, because monotheistic religions guarantee that at the end there will be revenge, right? So they don't need to act revengeful because at the end of times there will be like the compensation, right?
Exactly, the final reckoning, where all the tallies will be made and God will get the revenge on behalf of everybody. That's where Nietzsche finds resentment in the heart of monotheism, right? But there's something sort of really interesting then to the other element, which is what also is totally open-ended in the configuration of vengeance. Then it's not only when the idol will return. It's also, we have no clue how it will extract its vengeance or wreak its havoc. And that doesn't matter to the vengeful person either. You follow? That's why if you go back to cartoons, children have the best intuition of this. And you watch something like the Roadrunner and the Coyote, right? The Coyote can fail 1,000 times in its attempt to entrap the Roadrunner. And what does it do? Extremely versatile, goes back to the drawing board, fashions a new tactic, a new strategic sort of methodology. So the how doesn't really matter either. Although there are fantasies of the vengeful that they think of a perfect idealized way, but that usually becomes problematic. That's when you become an evil villain and you get yourself into trouble. Or that's when you become a serial killer. The serial killer gets caught because they develop a modus operandi, an MO, that is too rigid, that is too repetitive, that has no room for improvisation. If you guys want to know where the best theorization of that comes from, read Deleuze's Coldness and Cruelty at the outset of the book on of Massoch, where basically Deleuze says, I'll hang out with Massoch any day of the week, because even though he writes contracts like the devil with people, masochism is a far more liberating universe of improvisation and creativity and difference than the sadistic serial killer repetition compulsion, which is not pleasure. This is where Deleuze makes a really brilliant point. He says, sadism is never about pleasure. It's all about neurosis. It's entirely neurotic. So it's based in anxiety, which is its problem, which is why the killer is as much imprisoned in the ritual. Which, by the way, if you ever wanted a kind of empirical methodology of how to perhaps escape a serial killer, try and mess with their ritual. Ruin the ritual while they're performing it. Suggest alternatives. Instead of taking my eyes, take my hair. They'll hate that. They'll hate the kind of even the suggestion, mere suggestion of alternatives to them, right? Not saying anyway that hopefully you'll never have to use that, but a little piece of information for free on the side. Cool. So if the when and the why don't matter, there's one other component that also is completely open-ended and indeterminate in the vengeful universe, which is the where it happens. Here's a weird thing. You're standing there in front of a glass case, listening to the lament, as Nicole correctly said, the lament of, but also the angry tirade, the rant, and the boasting. I mean, for those of you who never read sort of pre-modern tribal war poetry, this is war poetry. The listing and the inventory of accomplishments, of grandeur, and all of that, the boast. And by the way, it's always done by those who are the most vulnerable to being exterminated and wiped off. Every tribe in the Arabian desert was at the cutting edge, at the razor's edge of extinction, of dissolution by another tribe. And so all that would remain is their poetics. That's why the poet was a sacred figure, but also a diabolical figure. Genies would whisper in their ears and all that and murmur to them. But here's an interesting question then. The relationality between you, again, a watcher staring into the glass case at this stripped idol who has had its jewels taken from it, has had its hair sort of damaged, has had its body chiseled holes into, so all these deformities, all these mutilations, all this humiliation, right? All this indignity and obscenity. What is your role in that as the modern museum goer? Are you complicit?
Yeah, entirely. Like, I mean, you're kind of tasked with the role of remembering.
Exactly. So here's where we get to the extreme outer boundary then of vengeful thinking. What happens when Batman finally kills the guy who killed his parents? Does he ever stop? No, the vigilante continues. There is no world beyond vengeance. That's why if you watch American Westerns or Italian Westerns, Sergio Leone, anytime the gunslinger, the outlaw who spent 30 years hunting down the person who killed his father or his mother, finally arrives at that showdown, that encounter, what has to happen as they shoot their nemesis? They also have to die. Either they die in the gunfight as well, or they ride off into the oblivion of the horizon on a horse, never to be seen again. The reason for that is there is no conceivable aftermath to the vengeful one. What's he going to do? Go and get a job at Home Depot and work a 9 to 5 and have a family in the suburbs? That would be ridiculous and pathetic. We want them to die at their height, at the culmination of their awful negative intensity, right? And so that's why we don't allow a future to the vengeful one. Well, the vengeful one realizes that too. So they basically have one of two possible crossroads before them. Either they can suicide themselves in despair once they've achieved victory and go down with which is essentially the pathology of a suicide bomber, right? Which is a pure logic of spite, by the way. And philosophies of spite, that hasn't been done well enough. Enough people haven't written on spite. What it means when that kind of inversion moment, existentially, when the life of the enemy is worth more than your own life to you in your own perception. We have to enter that. That's also a night question at some level. Because love also, the seeming opposite follows that. The sacrificial logic where the life of the other supersedes your own existence. So it's weird. Rage and love have kind of a partnership in that way only. But here's the question that I was asking, which was, what's the other possibility for the vigilante or the vengeful consciousness once they've gotten their person and kind of settled the score? They continue their spree. But now what's the logic? What's the kind of the interesting trajectory how do you continue when you've exterminated the one who did it? Someone says I was going to say forgiveness. Sorry, no, that's never an option.
Probably rebuild their power and like reinstate their power. So basically, if you're standing in front of the idol, if they get their revenge, you're probably to be killed. You're
Well,
either to be killed or to be transformed into someone who is to
good.
like bring them stuff. I don't
So
know.
the vengeful one basically then enters into a philosophy of resemblance, which is to say, now that I've gotten the actual or the authentic offender, now I'll get everyone that looks like them, right? And by the way, there is a very ominous resonance to the logic of totalitarianism and the paranoia of fascism that you see there as well. That's how you can then kill millions of children before they've even risen to the level of the offense, committed the crime, because they're already criminalized. You follow? They're already guilty in their inception. That is the ultimate kind of sort of tragic, atrocious limit of vengeance that can take place. So that's what happens, is that Batman kills the person who killed his parents, and then he starts killing everybody that looks like the person who killed his parents, right? And that's a very problematic thing because it's never identical. Now suddenly it's somebody who's committing sort of a different crime in a different context, and but look how intoxicating that mythology can be. We never question it, sort of in the darkness of the movie theater. And there's a reason, by the way, why movie theaters and cinemas simulate night around us, why they place us in the dark. It's because it allows us to side with things that we shouldn't. It tempts us to take the sides of things which we know are part of the logic of evil. And we'll get into that at some point. We'll get into that, especially next week even. So, okay, we're getting close to the point that I want everybody to introduce themselves. But is there, so there we are. We're standing in front of a being who has basically evoked a death sentence against the human race, right? An inhuman stone sculpture that is basically calling out the human race to a confrontation. And we are presumably human spectators in the museum at night conversing with this. What is our option then? We can have a Cassandra. Go ahead, Enda. What were you going to say?
Well, I just had a question about this because, you know, in one sense, the kind of the basis for the revenge of the statue is kind of tied to its kind of former sense of worth and value that was bestowed on it based on its original sort of conception as an artifact that kind of persists through time. You know, so the prior agency, you know, is in a sense somehow the source of value, but I think also the most culpable agency in a sense, because you know, the kind of effect of time results in a kind of retrospective mockery that this statue bears the brunt of as the object of that prior sort of agency. And so I don't know, like, I'm kind of curious. I think it's like a curious sort of like
good, excellent. So if there's a vampiric agency of the idol, what I mean by that is a parasitic agency. What do parasites do? They feed on things which are greater than themselves. Vampires feed on things which are lower than themselves, weaker than themselves. So it's not parasitic because presumably this was an object of worship. This was an object who could bring plagues and pestilence and storms upon the tribes that were made blood offerings. So this idol is superior. That's why it's a vampiric kind of parasiticism against us. What does it need? It needs someone to believe in it again in order to sort of restore its former glory, as you said. Are we that figure then? Is it an appeal or a plea of some kind, a supplication to ask us, is that why the boasting is taking place? Is that why the list of these things? Is that why there are subtle promises, obscene promises being made? By the way, in almost all monster narratives, there usually is an apprentice or an assistant. Vampires often have human beings working for them as sort of consorts who want to become part of, they'll sell out the human race, their own species, in order to evolve into this next being, in order to be turned, right? Dr. Frankenstein has his assistant as well, his Igor, you know, who sort of goes into the graveyards, does all the dirty work because he's been made promises of some kind, that he'll be part of the new age, the new epoch, the new rule, right? What would convince us to want to betray then our humanity? To become part of the matrix of the idols world or the idols regime? What type of consciousness has to emerge in the night to say yes to that? It's an interesting figure. the accomplice?
Shared torment, maybe?
Okay, tormented one, the one who has already lost in the human game, potentially, right?
Do you mind if I speak to
Please.
that? I was watching the film Dracula recently, and there is a similar figure. I can't remember his name. He lives in an asylum, and
Renfield.
Renfield, thank you. Yes, Renfield, and Renfield's motivation is the infinite. It's eternal life, I think, from memory in the film. So
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, there's if you go back to what's often considered one of the first literary works of Western modernity, which is Goethe's Faust, right? It's a deal with the devil, essentially, the narrative, for those of you who haven't read it. And it's a doctor, again, that was this great moment in a sort of transitional moment, this epochal moment where doctors were the most sort of insane and diabolical. So you have Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dr. Frankenstein, Dr. Faust. And so science was assumed at the gateway to modernity to be part of really sinister and disastrous things, and occult, a kind of a form of occultism. And we're just coming around to that again with references to the Black Mirror, you know, which is, by the way, at once your telephone or your digital screen turned off, but a black mirror is also what ancient sorcerers used to use, the volcanic glass mirrors, that in its kind of blurred obsidian stone, you would see reality in a different light. So the point that we were making therein was, what was Dr. Faust, saying that Dr. Faust is basically someone who believes that he has exhausted all the answers of the world, that he's exhausted the known world, and he's begging for any type of entity or force that will show him something new, that will show him the unknown. By the way, again, capitalism has a very, very powerful relationship to novelty, the new and improved, right? Which is part of the logic of modernity. Everybody always on the lookout for the next thing, the new thing, which is Faust's deal. Just show me something new and I'll give you my soul. I'll pledge my soul for it. So it could be the figure who has of absolute exhaustion or boredom. You know, it's an interesting thing that a lot of people don't know. It hasn't been studied enough. The influence of boredom or idleness in the history of literature and philosophy. Kafka used to brag like hell in his diaries that the source of his genius was his laziness. You know, a lot of people see Kafka as this meek, kind of slender, you know, East European, quiet, shy introvert. Not in the least. Kafka is aware that he is like nobody else. He says it, that he's the greatest writer to ever walk the earth. And I like that he says that. Because why else would you do it unless you don't think that? But he also didn't want to, again, to project his work into the world. He didn't publish it in his lifetime, as many people know. But there's an interesting thing. He says that it comes from his laziness or his idleness. A lot of people don't know that the origin of the essay with Michel de Montaigne, right? Who's Montaigne? He's a nobleman in France who's just noble enough, meaning just aristocratic enough that he gets a castle with servants, but not aristocratic enough that anybody cares what he thinks or involves him in big political issues. So he has a lot of wasted time on his hands all day, idle time. So he invents the essay as just a whimsical, now it's become this terrible neurotic academic exercise to write essays. It's just been stolen, all that. But it starts with a guy who just says, I don't know, what do I want to write about today? And that's why one of the first things that he ever writes, one of the first essays in history, is on cannibals. Just a kind of whimsical venture of the mind towards speculating on cannibals. And he ultimately sides with cannibals against French law and French legal structures. He says, I kind of like what they do better, their system of justice. There's a turn there. There's a very, very important turn that can happen among the bored. So is Dr. Faust just bored? Yeah, and is not boredom one of the fundamental problems of our modernity? Is that no matter how much sensory bombardment there is, no matter how much hyperstimulation, we are constantly bored. But that's also where extremely creative and shocking things emerge. Sasha, do you want to say something there?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to return to what Damon said about like people not people siding with idols because humanity kind of they kind of lost on the humanity, and for me this sides with Afro-pessimism, and but with also with and Frank B. Wilderson when he writes about Afro-pessimism, he describes the fact that Black people have never been actually seen as human, and this is from where he kind of starts thinking, and maybe this like the position of someone who has never actually been counted as human. And also there is like in the beginning of the poem there are like some clues to that, to the destructed city and stuff like this, and like and also like a more like another mainstream reference of the Xenofeminist Manifesto, which they start with "Our world is vertigo," but has it ever been otherwise? And for me, this kind of where this sort of like solidarity with the really angry idol can start.
Good. Absolutely. Absolutely. So any who have been wounded and sort of who have been misplaced and mistreated, there's an appeal to that. And the idol knows something. If you want to know what the genre of the historical loser is, you can look to any religion, right? Who are the ancient Jews who are compiling the first sacred text? They're slaves in captivity. Who are the first Christians? Highly persecuted fishermen, they're impoverished, the blind, the deformed, you know, and all that. And who are the first Muslim communities? Mostly slaves, right? And so the idol knows it's a safe bet to appeal to the losers of the human race because there's always more. They outnumber the winners. But there's an interesting thing there that also that precisely old world cultures understand. It's counterintuitive to our modern humanism. We think that narcissistic self-investment is the way to empower yourself, right? But that's a fast track to ending up on a psychoanalyst couch and talking about your mom and sort of into neurotic kind of problematics that paralyze you, debilitate you. God help you if you ever come across the person who serves an it. Right? That is a dangerous figure. Go and watch a missionary standing in the street hyping that Jesus's apocalypse is coming next Thursday. It can rain, it can snow, daggers could fall from the sky, and they'll stand on that street corner, unwavering. They won't feel a damned thing because they serve it. You follow? That anonymous, impersonal power of some other force, some outer force or something like that. It's a cool trick of consciousness that actually makes one far, far stronger. And we can talk about that to a certain extent because we're going to see how that works when the Minotaur says that they serve the labyrinth, not themselves. You follow? That actually is the source of their power. So we'll get into all of this. And so to be the servant of the idol is not necessarily a diminishment or enslavement, more than it is to be a human subject. That also has its own confines and limitations. So definitely the knight will be tied to the inhuman. We'll talk about that as well as the anonymous, the neutral, the impersonal. We'll get into all that stuff. So now we're at the threshold where I can switch to asking just all of you if you could introduce yourselves quickly. So I know who's playing the game, who's throwing dice with me for the rest of the term. You know, rather than, I talked to Sasha about this, who's our moderator, rather than the generic question of, you know, tell me who you are and where you are and what your academic context is, you know, everybody dreads that. Those are never, no offense, it's never interesting or that unique or pleasurable. No, everybody just sits there waiting for their turn and then begging for it to be over as soon as possible. Instead, let's ask a more provocative kind of rare question. Let's ask the question of it's an intriguing one, but let's just say, if there was one space, and by that I mean a natural space or a constructed space, that you would want to spend the night in solitude, what would it be? And there's no right answer. There's just interesting answers. What is the ideal space to dwell in for you tonight? Because I've tried this. I've slept in the sand dunes at night, and I've walked the streets of Tokyo City at night. And, you know, they each have their own flavor, their own atmospheres, their own possibilities. Which one intrigues you?
Oh, lichens. At night,
Mm-hmm.
the humidity of lichens is absolutely interesting, comfortable, very reassuring. It's also brings you to a level of, I don't know, quietness into the whole chaotic forest that moves around you. So
excellent.
It happens to me a few times that couldn't have time to proper setup as a trip in the middle of the night, and I just slept on lichens.
Oh,
lichens, I don't know how you say properly. Sorry, I'm very French.
Yeah.
So yeah, and when I was waking up, I was like, oh, I was, feeling like I was, getting away from it forever. So I was
excellent.
There.
Oh, that's great. That's an image of oblivion there. And also a sense that the natural, when you're there at night, it feels deeply unnatural. The jungle at night feels unnatural. And you're in nature. You're in the grip of nature. The forest feels unnatural. Every move, every sound, and all that. So excellent. Thank you. All right, so go everybody. Say your name for me and tell me where you want to go.
I can call out people, but I think it will be more kind of natural if people just start going. I will just be the last to answer.
Come on.
Yeah.
It can be anywhere.
Can you hear me? My internet is kind of.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I would say I think the womb, maybe the womb, not only because it's soothing place, but also because I like very much the idea of water and water, the dark waters, right? The primordial waters as sort of formless place. So I think it'd be interesting.
Wow, very cool. The womb. We've got the likes. We've got the womb. Excellent. You can, by the way, try out a sensory deprivation tank. You'll get a little bit of that. A little bit of water on the ground and pitch black darkness and no sound. Very good. Where are we going next?
Jason, I would say I would like to be in Sheikh Lotfullah Mosque.
The mosque.
Yeah, because I've been there at nights. What happens is that it's, you don't see the magnificent geometrical patterns and architecture. So there's another dimension to it, which is this how sounds move in the space, and it's just I've been there, I've played there, and it's just absolutely incredible.
So Nima is a Persian musician, and Sheikh Lotfullah Mosque, it's in Esfahan, right? And it's one of the most amazing architectural structures, but it's famous for its echoes and its acoustics. He knows that better than anybody as a master musician. So I like that. Yeah, sound is definitely crucial tonight, when vision especially gets lost, and you have to use the ears. I love it. Good. Where are we going next?
Maria, maybe?
Yeah, sure. Mine is, the first thing I thought of was suspended in the air in the middle of the ocean.
Nice. Wow.
So, surrounded by an infinite expanse and maybe lit by the moon.
Excellent. That's beautiful. Maria, Maurice Blanchot has a short story called Thomas the Obscure. Mm-hmm. And the first scene of it is of a night swimmer, which I actually used to do here. I'm in southern Spain right now, in the Mediterranean. There's a cove where I used to swim out in the middle of the night. And the reason I would do that is because there's a imperceptible, well, by day it's perceptible. There's a part where you can swim out and it's crystal blue and warm water until you hit this line among the waves where it gets deep black colored and freezing cold. And the reason is because you've fallen off a cliff underneath the water. Of course, you don't feel it because you're treading water and swimming out there. But below, it suddenly goes, and it's kind of a chilling, literally chilling, terrifying experience. Suddenly, you're in extreme depth and cold. And so you go back and forth, and it's this kind of cool, transgressive boundary and all that. So yeah, I like this idea of being suspended over the water at night. It's cool. You might like some of the literature of the night swimmers then. It's a cool genre. Excellent. Where are we going next?
Nicole? Oh.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, you can go first, I guess. It's fine.
Yeah, it's just easier to like track who said and who hasn't said.
Go ahead, Nicole, please.
Okay, so it'd be the delta of the Danube River on the Black Sea.
Oh, nice. Particularly, you want to describe it for us, for those who haven't been there?
Well, it's the biggest delta in Europe, and it's the area where the Danube, there's a particular place where the Danube flows into the sea, so the waters mix.
Beautiful. I like that. Great. Thank you. What do you got for us?
Nothing, and I'm thinking I should stay in a brothel at night. Well, I've never been in a brothel before, but I think there's a connection between night, darkness, and sex and porn to me. So, and it's also a place of relaxations and all kinds of feelings.
That's actually one of the figures or players of night, obviously, is the criminal, the deviant, the prostitute, the dealer, that are part of sort of that realm of temptation, the illicit, the forbidden. We'll get into that at some point, because that's definitely part of the undercurrent of night. And if you notice, all futuristic films that are, again, permanent night, all have that kind of that part of the city or that experience of the town where it's just the pleasure principles under neon lights. That's there. I thought you were going to say something different, because I know some of your interests from before. I thought you would say that that Chinese, the Fenke is written on the Chinese game of Go, which is an ancient game, and there's a room of masters that's secluded only for the best players, where supposedly he told me that it's believed that they can channel the spirits of the ancient players while they're in there. So I thought you were going to say the Go room. I think that might be.
Just to clarify, it's not a Chinese room; it's a Japanese room. So.
The Japanese room, that's right, but based on the Chinese game. Cool.
Right.
Where are we going next? Syed, you got something for us?
Sure.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's kind of like, I guess, banal. I'd pretty much stay in, outside on the street. I'm in Bombay right now, and just outside. There's this thing about the city that that Bombay doesn't sleep. It does, and then there's this other myth that Bombay just shifts ever so slightly when everyone goes to sleep. And I've kind of been playing this game with the city where it's almost like hide and seek, where I'm trying to find that one single moment of turning. And yeah, I think that's good.
That's great. That's great. Tell me if you find it. And feel free to interject it. That's excellent. Playing games at night, having tasks, and going out sort of looking for a particular thing. That's great. A nice fun game too, by the way, is to randomly choose a number and then decide that, you say 17, and then the 17th person that passes you or crosses you on the street is your arch enemy. And so you should spend the evening tracking and watching, eavesdropping, suspecting them of plots, so that every maneuver, every gesture you feel is some type of strange, conniving, cunning way that's against you, to defeat you. It's a cool little game to play.
Maybe Vanessa would want to say something.
Sure. I would probably be on a glacier in the high Arctic. There's something about the sounds there. It's very, it's otherworldly. It's almost like being in outer space. The environment is just very beautiful, but very extreme. And
have you been?
I have, yes. Yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Yeah, but I went during summertime, so I was on a glacier in the middle of the night, but it was 24-hour sunlight. So now I'd like to go in the middle of the night when it's darkness, because I would like to see the northern lights. Yeah.
Excellent. That absolutely. There's a conference that's held every 2 years, and it's the night conference, and it's held in the northernmost town of Norway. In
Svalbard.
Exactly.
That's where I went there. Yeah.
Okay, you went there. Have you done the sort of the wolf sledding and all of that in the mountains?
No, I was there for an artist residency, and we sailed the high Arctic Ocean, and yeah, we did a lot of hiking and trekking around the glaciers, and we were with a lot of scientists and naturalists, so it was, yeah, it was amazing.
Well, then we should all, after this course is finished, we should all apply for that conference and go take it hostage together. That'll be our sequel to the seminar. Good. So where are we going next?
Hannah, would you want to say something?
Sure. I think the moon.
Nice choice. Yeah, have you always had an intrigue for the moon?
Definitely, especially, yeah, it's very tied. I've always felt kind of connected to the cycles of the moon, and yeah, to bring up astrology, it's like my planet. So there's
cool, very cool. You know, of course, that the word lunacy, as in madness, is based on the etymology of the moon. Someone who has too close a relationship to the moon, to Luna, and all that. So there's something very cool there for sure. We can get into that, absolutely. Excellent, excellent. And the desolate nature of the moon is something really intriguing to consider. The craters, by the way, too. I used to study Islamic medieval science just for the fun of it. There are more, a lot of people don't know this, there are more craters named after Arab medieval scientists than of anybody else, because they were obsessed with them. The reason being that the crescent moon is the symbolic sign of Islam. And so it's one of the reasons why they were intrigued by that. But yeah, there are tons of these cool craters that were discovered by the medievals, and they would literally just sit and watch, and all the devices they had to engineer in order to detect the craters on the moon. Very cool stuff.
I've also always been really fascinated with that tale of the rabbit in the moon, and how the rabbit sacrifices himself in order to be immortalized on the face of the moon.
Very nice. You could write about that at some point in the class for sure. Keep that in mind. Good stuff. All right, these are all excellent. Keep going, people. I don't even have to do anything this semester. I can just let you roll. Where are we going next?
Yeah, I believe that, I don't know if it's a very trivial answer, but in an abandoned warehouse with open ceiling, surrounded by a big city with lots of movements and lights and sounds, with very loud techno playing. And I don't know if it's the abstinence of rave parties due to the pandemic, but I think that it would be interesting to experience that in solitude.
Excellent. I was going to say that rave culture obviously has the same sort of intense attraction to the industrial warehouse at night, the spontaneity of it, the fact that you don't return there every week, you always are in a different sort of abandoned space. There's great stuff. Free jazz movements that sort of began in abandoned industrial centers and all that. What's interesting there, just so you know, there's a kind of dark side of this too. In 3 weeks, we're going to read a play by Griselda Gambaro, who's an Argentinian writer as well. And it's a play where you're supposed to go to this industrial warehouse on the outskirts of a city. That's where it's held. And it's like almost you go from room to room with a guide, and it's almost a haunted house or freak show of episodic totalitarian things that happened during the Dirty War in Argentina. So the desaparecidos, the disappeared, an entire generation that kind of got taken off the streets in the middle of the night. And then when their parents or family would go the next day, the police would say, we have no record of that person ever existing. And to this day, the mothers and the grandmothers of Argentina have a parade, silent parade, where they march through the streets every year in honor of that. But she takes us into the inner sort of chambers of this warehouse, where it's the exact opposite of the delight that you talk about, which is the realm of the carnival, the circus, the masquerade. A lot of people forget that anarchists of the 19th century, their favorite paradigm, so while Marxists are fixated on revolutionary crowds, the anarchists love the paradigm of the masquerade, which is always a nocturnal kind of event where identities can be completely, again, reset. So very cool. I said, thank you. Where are we going next?
Hi.
Hey, Frederick.
I was gonna say the same. I mean, something similar, but playing noise, like noise, the genre.
Good.
In a nightclub or warehouse.
How do you perceive the movement happening in that space? Are people bouncing off one another? Is there collision?
I feel it's more like a paralysis for everyone. I don't feel like people tend to move when they're listening to noise. They're just listening to it like on their own world, like, yeah.
Good, good. Yeah, no, that's excellent. And we'll talk about interiority a lot in this class, the sort of the relationship of night as interior and exterior. Because without getting into it, I don't want to call it the dialectic, but the false dialectic of the inside and the outside is at the heart of every problem of the human and human consciousness that is revenging itself in grotesque ways against us. You know, it's how nations form. It's how the boundaries of sort of otherness are constructed and all that. So I like this idea that sometimes it's actually not this humanistic universality that is the answer to that problem. It's precisely what Frederick's talking about, the construction of a highly insular interior kind of chamber of consciousness that we'll talk about. Very cool, very cool. All right, where else?
Okay, James.
Carl,
maybe?
have you spoken yet?
No, I haven't. I'd probably sit at home at my desk with a critique of pure reason, and yeah, that'd be it.
God help us all. That's the most maybe dangerous person in the room here. The one who wants to spend the last night of existence with the critique of pure reason at the end of the earth. I like it though. Why not?
Yeah,
Why not?
I think everyone should do that. It would,
That's right. Just pull up your favorite book and just recline. Why not? Good, good, good. Where else? Who else?
James. James.
Hey, can you hear me? Hey.
Yes, James.
I'm not sure. I'm thinking. I'm in Lisbon right now, so I'm thinking of like a sort of wine cellar thing that like sort of been like forgotten in the subterranean area with some like vintage red wines and things and someone's forgotten me, and there's lots of candles around. Yeah.
That is great. I love the undergrounds and subterranean, the catacombs. These are great places, cisterns. I made to introduce all of you to, there's something called in Persian siyachale, which is like a black well. It was actually dungeon space or prison spaces in the old days, but now they've been converted. Just like in Russia, a lot of youth and experimental youth will go to abandoned submarine tunnels and places like that. So in the Middle East, a lot of people go into old dungeons and underground sort of place like that. The subterranean is a wonderful sort of habitus for us to talk about for sure. So we'll get into that. In terms of the wine cellars too, there was something that I was thinking about that I wanted to mention, which is, you know, when in Portugal, I'll say this quickly, there's a cool ritual that probably none of you have ever heard of. And it's one that's known kind of exclusively among writers as a nice secret. There's a place in the undergrounds of Lisbon where you're supposed to go and write a single line, literary or poetic line, if you're a writer there, and you're supposed to leave it there in the darkness. The code or the oath that you have to swear is that you will never publish it, never utter it, never print it again. You leave it there as a kind of sacrificial offering to the dark. And the test of a great writer is, will you throw away some mediocre line, some impromptu line, or will you give the darkness your best line? The good ones leave their best down there. There's a certain freedom in that secrecy of knowing that as much as they read you, as much as you're published, they'll never have that one line. So I like this notion. Thanks, James. Where are we going next?
Alejandra, maybe?
Alejandra, hello.
Hi. Maybe also in the ocean, swimming in the ocean, but in the Gulf of Mexico. And it's a peculiar thing because I'm a myope. I cannot see without my glasses. So when I go to the sea, I cannot see. I cannot. So, but I can hear and I can feel with my skin. But also it's the Gulf of Mexico, it's a very contaminated area, and I'm not sure that it's safe for humans.
Nice.
But I have a really close relation with that sea because people go to swim there even when we know that it's so contaminated. Yeah.
That is great. I like that. And we'll talk about that actually, the idea of contamination, impurity. Night is always, because it's also one of the playgrounds of supposedly of demons and devils. So it's always about contamination and impurity. Excellent, excellent. By the way, there's a version of that on the Persian side, the Iranian side. The Caspian Sea is so full of salt and so that it's famous that every year a number of people drown, because if you go to wipe your eyes while you're in the water, you blind yourself. And then you can't tell which way the shore is and which way the depths are. And so a lot of people just find themselves in the drift out there. So definitely, very cool, very cool. Is there anyone left in the midst of things?
Yeah, there are a few. Yeah,
Leah,
Leah.
I saw a hand. Leah, go ahead, please.
Hi. Yeah, the first thing I thought of, like, speaking of masquerade, is this kind of weekend when I fell by accident into a carnival celebration in Mexico, and they wear these masks called chinelos, which are like, it's almost like a white face, and it's like a really long, like, pointed chin, and it's like to mock like the European colonialists basically, but just kind of walking by myself, like not dressed, and then ending up in a parade, in this masquerade parade, was one of the most like surreal, and like it ended up being kind of just like a supernatural experience. And I think if I could like remove the creepiness, or maybe keep the creepiness but know that I was okay, then I would want to kind of spend the night observing that. And also I'd be curious to kind of watch everyone de-mask after a night like that.
That is it's a great observation. For those who have studied mysticism very rigorously, it's not something magically supernatural or anything. Oftentimes it's just about mastery of perception, mastery of certain physicality, performativity. That's where the being able to walk on coals, or pierce your body and not feel it, or starve yourself for long periods of time. It's highly material. And even if you go back to so-called magicality, you notice that witches' brews are always filled with very mundane objects. A frog's eyes or something. It's not something that you have to find in some elixir in the Platonic ether, of the skies. It's not something idealized or something. It's found in the forest. It's found in the outskirts, usually, from the ground. Interesting thing then about the carnival experience that you're talking about in Latin and South America versus, let's say, the carnivals of the US, which always take place not in the center of the city, but on the outskirts of the small towns. And it's kind of this seedy, roaming non-community of people, untrustworthy. But nevertheless, parents would let their kids once a year go to this illicit space, of pleasure and consumption and all of that. But in order to guarantee their return, the idea was that there would be this momentary expenditure, where they would get it out of their system and vicariously, sort of watch the freak show and experience radical strangeness, and then come back to the folds of the sanctified world. And it's interesting, those rare exceptions of people who ran away with the carnival. Just like in the feudal era, those rare people in Europe who ran away with the pirate ships to escape feudal oppression. That absolute determinism that if your father was the blacksmith of the village, you're going to die the blacksmith of the village. Right? There's no up, down, there's no anywhere horizontal. Some of them went to the oceans and just joined the pirate ships, just like those who ran away with the carnivals. But it's interesting, for those who study mysticism rigorously, entrancement, how you actually conjure a state of trance, is something very systematic and precise and intricately performed by shamans throughout history. They know how to do that, how to create that collective experience. And it goes against a psychoanalytic presupposition, by the way, which is that delusion or madness usually cannot be transmitted, right? It is exponentially harder to convince someone else of your hallucinatory state, right? And yet shamans precisely are able to maneuver that trickery of how to have collective experiences of hysteria or collective experiences of delusion or hallucination or illusion or whatever you want to call it. Very cool. Thank you for that. Anybody left in the game still?
Yeah.
Is that Alexander who said that?
No, but I'll go next.
Go ahead, Alexander.
Yeah.
Me? I'll just go really quick. I apologize for any noise. I'm on the streets of San Francisco right now. So actually, I used to work graveyard shifts at a semiconductor manufacturing plant. And it's kind of a surreal space because there's this ritual to entering the inside of a clean room, because a clean room has like very strict specifications about what kind of particles you're allowing in it. So you would don specific garb before entering the clean room. There's like this major focus of purity. But once you're inside the clean room, it's kind of like a clockwork city in a way, because it's just the sound of machines just running constantly, like vacuums, pneumatics, and hydraulics. So it's like this calming, I wouldn't say white noise, but like noise.
Well
So I would, yeah.
Absolutely, well said. And just quickly there, the term graveyard shift, which you used to work, comes from those who used to obviously work the graveyards at night, because all those burial processes are not things that people want to stomach or see during the day, decomposition and preparation of the bodies. But interesting little fact that a lot of people don't know is that Nietzsche served for 2 years in the Prussian War as an orderly, whose job was to collect the bodies on the battlefield every night with a wheelbarrow. And one of the first images of Thus Spoke Zarathustra is of Zarathustra carrying a corpse up the mountain himself. And he literally performed that task every night for 2 years in battlefields. That has a way of affecting you. When you work at night and you work the graveyard shifts, definitely it changes your perception of things. That's great, and especially towards mortality. But I like your introduction of the machine. That's going to be really important for us too. Excellent. Who else was supposed to go now? Sasha.
I could go next. Since you mentioned Zarathustra, Jason, I think I would like to spend the night in the ancient ruins of Zoroastrians in the outskirts of Yazd, the city in Iran, in the desert, especially in the Dakhme, which was a tower which they did the process of excarnation, not burying their dead, but rather laying them in the open to be purified by the blaze of the sun. So that would be a cool place to spend the night.
Yeah, you guys should Google the Tower of Silences of the Zoroastrians. It is a cool place to spend night. There, by the way, there's also something there, because they're fire worshippers. Then you always have these eternal fires that are also blazing there in the midst of the dark. Great. Cool. Peter, did you have or who was going next?
Yes, I can say
Go ahead.
Go next.
Yeah, hi, I'm Peter. It's actually night here, by the way, as I'm from the Upside Down in Melbourne. We've been in lockdown for a long time. I think I'm very tempted by the rave, the techno club experience as well. But since that's already been said, I will say the last time recently. I went camping and I attempted astrophotography, and we were in what we call the bush here, I guess, where you go camping by a creek, and you know, we're just out in the stars, and we had a camera and we attempted it. Just being in the bush among the stars, I guess, looking out among the stars, but I think as well maybe hunting down some rare astronomical phenomena or something, and staying awake to photograph it could be a nice thing to do.
Stargazing, absolutely. By the way, you can go out to the sand dunes of the desert. It's one of the best places to stargaze. I was going to say something though to that quickly that you mentioned. Repeat again the first part that you had said. I'm sorry. Just say that one more time.
That we went. My first experience was recently. It was camping. We go camping into the bush in Australia, and the stars are very clear there, which I don't usually see because I live in the city. So I always like going out to the bush and seeing the stars behind.
Absolutely. So this is going to be really intriguing for us in 2 weeks' time. when we talk about the night and this, or actually next week even too, with a little bit of the Babylonian prayers of night, that when you're facing the celestial, you know, and the celestial is not again transcendent, it's visible, it's manifest, you know, it's overhanging like a sort of a tapestry right above you, and almost crashing down upon you. It's going to be really interesting for you to see how the ancients reconciled living sort of beneath the stars, and how you could interact with sort of those shapes and those silhouettes. Very, very cool. All right, who we have? Evren, did you go?
Yeah, I would love to be deep in the jungle, so basically to hear the sounds all throughout the night. So sounds drastically change in the absence of lights. Yeah, I would be in the jungle too.
Have you ever heard of a South American writer named Horacio Quiroga?
No.
Alejandro, you know him? Horacio Quiroga, do you know his work?
Yeah, I read him in high school. Yeah.
Oh, in high, God, what crazy teacher gave you him in high school?
No.
That'll screw you up. Quiroga's story is an interesting. He's got a collection of short stories called The Decapitated Chicken, and basically, and the first story in it is about the snakes of the jungle, and they're talking about the humans who are coming into the Amazon and who are taking their homes and how they have to go to war with them. But what's really interesting in Quiroga's life, if you Wikipedia the guy, you can see what happened to him, which is basically he was a writer. And he got a job, a very easy job, he thought, which was that a company said, we want to build in the jungle in the Amazon, so we're going to send you there, and you just live there and protect it from anybody else kind of coming on the land. And he goes out there with his first wife, and she kills herself. Now, by all accounts, Quiroga was one of the nicest, kindest, most gentle people you could meet. But the jungle apparently made her mad. And then one of his children did, and then his second wife. And he was alone at the end of his life. The jungle took all of them from him. And it's a very interesting thing that he writes about that, about the madness that happens in the jungle at night and how you have to leave at certain points. He realized his fatal mistake was he didn't leave enough. And so very cool idea. Sasha, is there anyone left behind?
Yes, there are a few people. Maybe Agatha, I'm sorry.
Yes. Hi.
Hello.
So instead of being placed somewhere special, I would like to get a gift of courage to spend the night alone somewhere what is not my home. Like I think there is a lot of afterlife at night, and yeah, so.
I like that. Yeah. This is very good. There's also, by the way, just a quick thing. There's a type of experience where you can train yourself perceptually to feel as if the familiar is unfamiliar. I actually had a weird old professor when I was at Columbia University when I was many decades ago. He used to come into class on the first day. He was a philosophy professor. He would put a water bottle on his desk and he would tell everybody, stare at that until it looks weird to you. That was the exercise. This guy, he wasn't that eccentric, but that was his first exercise. And you know what happens after you stare at a water bottle for 45 minutes? It starts to look weird. You know, its shape, its profile, its materiality, you know, it becomes, and you can do that. You can train yourself sort of to decodify familiarity with everything and see the kind of fictive absurdity of all things around you, including your most intimate spaces. So the real trick is not to leave your room, but to believe that your room is not your room anymore. You know, and even Freud teaches us in psychoanalysis, if you take it to its correct logical presumption, if you believe in your own name, you're already psychotic. You're already in psychosis just to believe your own name. So to believe that you have a room, that it's your room, is also a psychosis. So we have to try and unravel that. Night allows us to unravel the assumption of familiarity. Excellent, Agatha. That's a great point of departure. What else we got?
Alexei.
Yep. Please don't tell anybody that I said it, but can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you. We're waiting.
Okay. Don't tell anybody that I said it, but in Belarusian government house, not in the role of somebody who works there, but because of the experience and because of the possible circumstances that will bring me there.
It's very interesting, and some of us know where you are right now, and those are heavy words. Interesting thing. If you worked in the censorship bureau, you get access to it's a great job to have. You get access to all the forbidden, outlawed literature. And there's this phenomenon called double consciousness that often happened, which is if you spend all night long reading revolutionary and rebel literature, you start to sympathize with it. You know, you're supposed to be finding them so you can execute or imprison these people, but you start to become increasingly, you gain an acquired taste. So oftentimes there would be this cool collision that would happen with those who are supposed to be the ideological guardians, that they would actually become sort of the internal conspirators just through exposure. So you should want a job, in the censorship bureau, I think. I'm sure you'll read all the best stuff tonight. Cool. Who else? Sasha.
Okay, Andrew, I suppose, or no, sorry.
Hi, Kamanji.
Sorry.
Hey, I'm like 6 or 7 years old, and maybe that's when I've discovered imagination, and it's in the middle of night, and the night just goes on and on and on. I can't sleep, and then maybe it starts to rain, and you can hear the drops hitting the roofs of other houses before it gets to yours, and maybe you're inside your mother's bed and small. Yeah.
I like that. Okay, so we'll talk about insomnia at some point as a kind of third alternative to consciousness and the unconscious. We'll also talk about the sleepwalker at some point in this class. But the insomniac is a wonderful figure for us to explore because they're neither bound by the rules of consciousness nor the unconscious. And actually, here's an interesting thing. The very definition of a knight in the medieval era, you know, the champions, the knight, the heroes, is that they were forced or willed insomniacs. They would hold vigil all night. They would keep watch over the cities, keep guard by staying up at night. And that they were able to ascertain movements, threats, all kinds of possibilities, while others were under the protective layers of sleep. So I like that. We'll definitely talk about the insomniac because often heroes are insomniacs, often villains are insomniacs. We'll see where the lines are there. Cool. Sasha, where are we at?
Yes, we're like Andrew, I suppose.
So first image that came to me was to be above a valley, looking down on the lights of a city, more or less.
Nice. That would be great. Chasms are probably my favorite geographical space. So yeah, we'll talk about that too. The founder of New Wave or avant-garde poetry in the Middle East was a shepherd in chasms who would write nocturnes. So he would go up there at night to graze because it was too hot during the day, and he would just sit overlooking the valleys below and all the stone formations. And he started to believe after a while that he could communicate with elemental forces. He believed that he could ask the winds to blow or ask the moon to swell. He could bring rain forward. And he writes that in his poetry. Whether he could or not, who knows? But it's a cool thing to believe you can do. It's better than being an academic. Trust me.
Federico, I haven't seen you.
Hey everybody. So I was thinking of, I don't know, an arcade. Sleeping at night in an arcade with all the lights on and all the neon brights and the tickets falling on the floor. Because
you
don't
mean like the Walter Benjamin arcade. You mean like
no
the video game arcade, right?
Yeah, video game
Excellent.
arcade.
I prefer that. Nice. Good. Nice. And what about it? You just want to play all the games to yourself?
Yeah, it's a place I associate to my childhood. Like I went like to these like photocopy of Chuck E. Cheese in my childhood. So it's like, yeah,
that is a childhood fantasy to have access to the amusement park or the arcade all night. You know, not have to wait in any lines, not have to compete with anybody. And there is a cool way of thinking of the sounds of the sort of those things as lullabies in and of themselves, for sure. I like that. Very nice. Thanks, Federico. Sasha,
yeah, we have Vincent left, I suppose. Vincent,
please.
Yes. Or have you spoken? I'm sorry if you have. I'm still kind of confused, but there are so many people.
No, Vincent, can you unmute yourself, please?
Can you?
Oh,
sorry.
Again.
Sorry. Yeah,
I'd be thrilled to stay in a kind of simple floating vessel, but against a dark oceanic turbulence, something like that. Something that coaxes spatiotemporal disorientation, kind of refraining from the comforts of the ground, something like that.
Absolutely. You know, there were ancient cults in the Nile River Valley that believed, don't ask me why I know this stuff, but there are ancient cults in the Nile River Valley that believed that there were certain nights every decade or so when if you would sleep in a floating vessel like a boat on the Nile, you could perceive that there are nights when the sky falls to earth. And so when those dimensionality, the separation between earth and sky is completely collapsed onto one another. So yeah, you should have joined an ancient Egyptian cult. You'd have a lot of friends. Excellent, excellent.
I suppose Enda, did you speak, Enda?
Yeah, no, I'll just go quickly. I mean, my one would be a mine shaft. There's a really good short story by Hoffman called The Mines of Falun, and this guy has a hallucinogenic dream about this kind of like old miner who kind of convinces him to leave his life as a seafarer and go to the mine. And I won't spoil the end, but basically that dream has kind of compelled me to want to have that experience, although I don't think he has the dream within the mine. But yeah, I think it'd be quite interesting to see this guy.
Beautiful, beautiful. The mine shaft, definitely. It's a fascinating spatiality, depth, holes. That's going to be really essential to us in this. You know, Deleuze has a moment in The Logic of Sense where he talks. He's a chapter called "The Schizophrenic versus the Little Girl," and he's talking about Antonin Artaud versus Alice in Wonderland. And he couldn't figure out for years why, because Deleuze loves Artaud and he loves Alice in Wonderland. But Artaud hated Alice in Wonderland. And he hated Lewis Carroll, even though weirdly, he accused Lewis Carroll of time traveling into the future to plagiarize Alice in Wonderland from him. That's Artaud's great schizophrenic illusion of grandeur and arrogance, that he time traveled to steal it from him. But he doesn't understand why there's this disjuncture, why Artaud has such hatred and distaste for the depth of the rabbit hole. And we'll get into that for sure when we talk about holes in the night and the depths. Thank you for that. Excellent.
Okay, we have one last person, and it's Evrim. Evrim, are you here? Evrim, hey. Hey, hi, you're back. Yes.
Yeah, I already.
Yeah, Evrim already.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Then I seem.
Yeah, I'm left.
Shilpi.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, hi, Jason.
Hi.
Well, I would like to be on the terrace of my childhood home, staring at the stars.
Excellent. I like the terrace and the balcony are very powerful spaces as well. There's a whole poetics and philosophy of space that you can do about the terrace and the balcony. Shout out to my heritage, my Persian heritage. The word balcony comes from the Persian balakhane, which means upper house. Interesting thing to know there. But especially in the pandemic era with lockdowns, the balcony came and has a completely new and renovated meaning and possibility to it. It kind of has the functionality of the window now for a lot of people, especially in Mediterranean cities where I am, where everyone has balconies. It becomes the outside, even though it's a very small, narrow space of the outside that you can enjoy. So very cool. I love it. From wombs to mine shafts to terraces to chasms to excellent. Good to see.
Okay.
You guys did great. We're way over time, but
I wanted to say as well, I'm the last left, and so I would love to spend night in a seaport, because it might be a weird place to be because it kind of combines this, it has this 24-hour movement, and it also has this the sea, which is or like the ocean, which is kind of omnipresent, and it has its own sound and it has its own agency. And yes, and it would be like really interesting to see like this 24/7 presence, which is kind of human and not exactly human, and to look at this perpetual movement. I don't
Sasha, you
know.
know, if you ever read Albert Camus' The Plague, which was his last work, and actually, if
I have read it.
you know The Plague then, and you know that it's set in the seaport city of Oran in northern Algeria, facing the Mediterranean. And it's a historical city of pirates and smugglers and all that. Transitional communities. Nobody really lives there very much. Most people just pass through. And so what ends up happening is it's a perfect place to envision the end of the world for Camus. And I've been to Oran, and what you realize quickly is everybody lies to you. Nobody tells you who they really are because they're only there for one night and then they're on the ocean again. So why not just wear a mask and pretend to be something else? It's a great space. And absolutely, we'll talk about the seaports as well. Very, very good. All right, then. I think we covered everyone, no?
Oh, yeah, we did, I suppose.
Perfect. So we need, Sasha, you were going to say that for next week, we need presentations, right?
Yes. I was actually about to turn to some logistical stuff. And so firstly, yes, presentations. And the way I suppose the way we got to do this this time, since there are a lot of us, I will circulate the list, and people will just sign up for presenter and the respondent, because if we do it now, it will take like a lot of time, and we're like way over time right now.
Right.
And yes.
Can I just explain quickly what the weekly assignments are going to look like? Assignments are that obviously your final writing occurs at the end of the 8-week journey that we do together. But every week I do want you to submit notes. And the reason for that is just they can be unfinished, unformed, sort of fragmented half thoughts of notes. But the reason is because every week I'm going to ask you to chase for an obscure example in a particular modality. One week it will be an image, one week, but next week it will be a myth, superstition, legend, fable, or folkloric example of night. From whatever obscure civilizational recess you want, from whatever back alley or back forest of whatever homeland or territory you want, just find, can be ancient, can be medieval, can be whenever, okay? But just find me a cool story of night. That's not literature, but more mythology or legend or superstition or folklore or you know, kind of mythic in that regard. So just go and find. It can be about a creature of night. It can be about a space of night. It can be about a force of night, a god or goddess of night, any type of thing that you want. Okay. And just for next week, just post when Sasha's going to circulate for you the Google Drive place to just post it. Just post your notes, and so the example, specify it, give a quick 1 or 2 sentence summary and some conceptual kind of thought, so that later at the end of the semester, when you go to assemble all these pieces, you remember your train of thought and what you found compelling and what connections you made conceptually. If night there is tied to violence, if it's tied to pleasure, if it's tied to forgetting, if it's tied to, you know, whatever, estrangement, you know, just figure out the concepts that you think are the scaffolding of what it's trying to unveil. So whoever does presentations for next week too, I would like them, those 4 or 5 people or 3 or 4 people, to present their myth that they've uncovered somewhere in the world, somewhere in time. So not about the readings, which are the 3 short stories of Borges.
Yeah, I will I just really wanted to ask you guys what works better for you, since I didn't expect that big of a crowd. So basically, there are options, either Facebook or just Google, just Gmail, basically. And I will send it to Gmail. Okay, people don't have Facebook. Okay, then I will just email everyone.
We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out in the next day or two, and we'll let you know where to post. Okay,
Yeah,
just
okay.
your notes for each week. All right. And so again, the reading assignments are 3 short stories by Borges. It's not a lot of reading, but I want us to do close reading on this. Really get into every single line. The first one is Circular Ruins. The second, which is about a mystic who dreams a person into being. The second one is the Library of Babel, and the third is the House of Asterion. Asterion is the Minotaur. It's just he chooses to use his proper name instead of the name of the half bull, half person that he is. Okay, so those are the 3 readings, and then find me a myth from somewhere cool. It can be a fairy tale too. There's no high or low culture.
Okay.
All right.
So we're
We're
done,
good,
aren't
right?
we?
We're off the clock. This was fun, guys. It's a blast. Looking forward to seeing you next week.
Bye. Bye.
Bye now.
Bye. This is awesome.
Thank you. This is really
Bye.